Okay. All right. 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DCN and JOC election night broadcast. It's our first ever live stream event that our newsroom is going to be trying, and why not? With this epic election being held during a pandemic, why wouldn't we try to do this for our readers, our listeners, through the Construction Record podcast who are familiar with us? So we have the news team assembled tonight for you to talk all things construction related with this election. So why don't we go around the horn and introduce folks? Introduce yourselves, folks, because not everybody will be familiar with all of us. So why don't we start from top left and go forward? Go ahead, Warren.
Warren.
Lindsay Cole, editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce.
Don Wall, Daily Commercial News, staff writer.
Bench.
Hi, I'm Angela Gismondi, Daily Commercial News staff writer.
Hi, yeah, I'm Russell Hickson. I am a reporter at the Journal of Commerce on the West Coast in Vancouver, BC.
So, folks, here we are. We're going to be, for everyone that is tuning in with us, we will be with you not throughout the whole night, but for the next 3 hours or so. You could expect to have us here with you as we follow election night results, as we discuss some of the issues that we see as pertinent and crucial to construction that may or may not have been discussed on the campaign trail leading up to tonight. And I'm sure that's going to generate a bit of fodder. And we also have some specific feature interviews with some special guests that, full transparency here, we recorded earlier today and the other day, but we're going to share with you. But before we get into that, here we are. The team is assembled. And why don't we somebody jump in and tell us, what are you expecting tonight?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm expecting a non-result tonight. to be quite frank, I think we're in unprecedented times, and with that comes some interesting ways to mail in your ballots, advance polls, whatnot. So there's going to be a bit of a delay. So from a news perspective, sadly, I don't think we're going to have a concrete answer. But from a pandemic standpoint and an interesting element, we're going to, I guess, see what comes in the coming days.
Yeah, I believe they had a request for 1 million mail-in ballots, which is way far ahead of like the 2019 election, which I think was like 50,000 or something like that. So that's probably going to slow things down because they have to make sure that those people didn't go in and vote in person and vote by mail, of course. So that's probably going to delay things a little bit. So yeah, I agree with Lindsay that it's probably going to be much later.
My gut says, to quote David Byrne, same as it ever was. but on the other hand, in 2015, the Liberals were a spent force, and all of a sudden they weren't. They were a majority. So who knows?
It's exciting. Even the first hour of results coming in, a little bit of stronger conservative results than were predicted. Up a few seats. It's very early, of course, but could be some surprises ahead of us. So I think I think we'll all be paying attention to our local broadcaster in the background as we watch the polls come in.
Definitely.
But you got to wonder. I was wondering, Ange, you were covering some stuff as well leading into this campaign, right? And so, what do you think? Is going to happen tonight? Kind of based on what you're seeing on your end of the world there.
Well, I think everything's kind of up in the air. It's I think, just to echo what everyone is saying, it's a close race. They seem to be neck and neck in the polls, and just excited to see what happens tonight.
I gotta put this out here. An election's called. We're in a pandemic. A lot of people not so thrilled an election is called in a pandemic. But from our newsroom standpoint, did it come as a surprise to any of you guys?
No. I mean, it got telegraphed a month beforehand, basically. We all it was in the air, and not just with the news, but everybody kind of knew.
Now, on your boots on the ground, were people opinionated when it came to that election call.
Yeah, speaking of stakeholders in Ontario, I know nobody was surprised about it. I mean, they were kind of like, why was an election called during a pandemic? But definitely not surprised. They kind of knew, they saw it coming.
Yeah, I talked to Daryl Reed of the Progressive Contractors Association, and he laid it out. It's unnecessary, but everybody thought within the first few days that would dissipate. We'd get into the meat of the election, lots of issues, but I think people kept on making Trudeau pay for it throughout the campaign. He may be on his way to a minority again, but if any, I think that early call, just the way it's happened with David Peterson back in Ontario a few decades back, people didn't forget that what was called an unnecessary election. So I think that story has legs.
It's interesting because he was getting things passed through, and these are the discussions having with our stakeholders and our editorial advisory board members and just general people checking in to see what we think from a construction standpoint. Like, Trudeau wasn't meeting much resistance in trying to get some of his policy stuff through, and some of the stuff that pertains to our industry, it was kind of rolling along. You take away the pandemic, the issues of climate change, green infrastructure, transit investment, labor. Like, I mean, these are all issues that persist with the backdrop of the pandemic still existing, right? But it's with the eye to the post-pandemic, whenever that is, post-pandemic time, because this industry's been humming along during the pandemic.
Well, that's Trudeau's big line. That's right? Been whenever he is posed that question, he says, well, I want Canadians to choose how we finish this, right? That's kind of been his, I guess, defense of the pandemic election call. And I think no matter what, he probably would have been criticized if he called an early election, if he waits. I mean, the opposition's going to, find a way to probably criticize him, I think.
Like, I think it was a little extra fodder, and I don't know if you guys picked up on it. The last week or so, all of a sudden the price tag started getting affixed to the election.
Right? Oh, the $600 million.
$600 million, yeah.
You know what I mean? I don't know who we give the gold star to. Was it the NDP or the Conservatives who coined it first? But all of a sudden, it was like every other clip that you saw in the regular commercial media, it was about the $600 million election coming out of both of those leaders' mouths, right? I don't know if it really hurt Trudeau in the end. I think he was destined for minority government regardless. I think he goes full mandate or not. I think we're still going to be at the same. I guess the margin is what we're looking at here, and it's going to be days, maybe a day or two, till we know that margin, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But the more things change, the more they stay the same. So I think we're in a changing environment on a pandemic front, and we have no idea what's going on with that. But I think we're going to stay status quo when it comes to our government. And maybe, it's steady as she goes. I have no idea. But I think it's pretty funny that all along the NDP and Conservatives have been saying, we didn't need this election, but yet, I don't know. My perception is that they didn't. All of them seemed to hit the ground running on the campaign trail and didn't necessarily mind doing so. My perception of things.
Yeah, I think the Green Party was probably caught a little flat-footed, and the other parties, like you said, I think hit the ground running. But I mean, I think the Green Party, although they picked up steam recently, like they're not running candidates in as many places. They obviously have some internal problems that they were working through that are still ongoing. So I think they were kind of probably caught a little flat-footed, in my opinion.
I'm stereotyping here, but out west, the Green Party typically carries a little bit more, weight, for lack of a better term, out there. What are you guys seeing? Are you seeing that at all?
I mean, Anime Paul barely came out here. She did eventually, but she barely did. So who knows? I'm just watching the results right now, and it's super early, but the Greens aren't doing well at all. But then again, it's also the East, right? So who knows? When we hit tomorrow, we might see something different happen.
I think a lot of people who are further left see Trudeau as kind of like a lukewarm progressive, and but I mean, you always have the moment. I mean, everybody talks about strategic voting, but at the end of the day, like even polls can kind of not capture this. People could make like last second decisions when they're in that booth and they're voting, and they think, do I vote Liberal and, vote a little bit more strategically, or do I vote Green or NDP? And that's really, I think, difficult to predict, kind of that last second swing that can happen where people may be, I want to go more Green or I want to go more NDP or this or that. But when you're in that booth and you all of a sudden have to, put your pen on the ballot, some people can swing one way or the other. So that's hard to predict, I think, in polls.
I find that it's a shame. Just I do want to transition to something around the industry, but when I think about Anime Paul, right, by far probably the best performance of the debate, the English language debate.
Yeah,
easy, right? Kind of, she took what was given to her. You know what I mean? She was given a platform and she pushed all the green language, the green ideas, and she answered questions and she dove in. By far the best performance, I thought, and not just me, but I think a few others as well. But it's a shame, as Russ was saying, that they were so divided and such a mess heading into the election, right? Because then you look at what their results are, but you see how the People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier, who hasn't been getting play in the mainstream media, you know what I mean, how they're tracking in some areas in the West. And that kind of came up in some of my feature interviews today that we had. It's like, well, look how they're tracking. What is that story, the PPC story, and how it impacts the Conservatives and the Liberals, right? You know what I mean? Because the Aaron O'Toole numbers spiking in high in the beginning, but to believe the pundits and they're just looking at it, as we started getting to election day, the support was starting to dwindle. Is it because his base, that conservative, really right-wing base, was unhappy with him at one point and thought, you know what, PPC speaking my language more than he is?
And then
go ahead, Warren.
Let's say they don't. I'm not saying one way or the other, but let's say they don't win and they go into a minority again and Aaron O'Toole loses his job. Do they go, well, that was a mistake, and then veer further right to get those guys back? Maybe they will.
Well, I think probably Beck. Sorry, go ahead, Don.
I was wondering what happens in Alberta. If, there's some discussion. There's some under the radar support for the PPC. So if they poll up into the teens, that polls. So what does that do? That splits the right vote, the vote on the right, just like the Reform and the Conservatives used to do, paves the way for somebody like Jean Chrétien to get all his majorities. So does that pave the way for the Liberals to get a few seats in Alberta if the vote is split there? So some things could happen that are pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in Alberta.
Yeah, I agree with you there, especially with all the controversy around.
Yeah, Jason
Mr. Kenny
didn't help Aaron O'Toole's chances. Let's put it that way.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about construction a bit here as we start to work our way to our first feature interview. Anybody want to jump in and kind of say what they thought of some of the platforms and which one maybe spoke most to the immediate needs that we know of this industry? Or do we want to list those needs first and then dive in? I leave it to you guys.
I thought it would be kind of cool to set the stage and just have, our writers speak to who they talk to on the industry level when it comes to, basically when we talk in our editorial meetings to give you guys some context. We always try to shape things out. So one of our first things was to get a feel of where the industry lies and what their wants are for this election. No matter who's in power, there's some obviously steadfast wants that this industry needs and has alluded to. So I don't know, from my perspective, I thought it would be kind of cool to hear from the reporters when it comes to what they covered. So we had Don doing the national story, speaking to some national industry stakeholders. Russ doing his wants from the West, a clever little headline there, Russ, talking to some Western stakeholders, and then Angela speaking to some Ontario-specific stakeholders. So I don't know. I thought, Don, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit about what the national stakeholders wanted?
A story we posted exactly a month ago, August 20th. So I spoke to 5 national executive stakeholders: Canadian Construction Association, Progressive Contractors Association, as I said, consulting engineers, mechanical contractors, and building trades unions. So I talked to each of them, asked what their priorities were, and it's pretty interesting to see now were their priorities, were the issues they wanted to address, were those represented? In some cases, they were. So as I say, so Reid was the one who said, Darrell Reid of PCA, Vice President of Public Affairs, he didn't think the Prime Minister made a good case for calling the election. And so, we've discussed whether he has or not. So CCA President Mary Van Buren said talked about her association advocating for infrastructure for the past 5 years, wanting a long-term infrastructure plan. She hoped to see that discussed extensively. Sort of John Gamble of the engineers, and sometimes you wonder. He hopes to have a fulsome discussion of the issues and meaningful discussion about the infrastructure and how it can be leveraged to both expand the economy and address the nation's environmental challenges. I think it's been said by people like Kim Campbell a while ago, and John Gamble said elections aren't places to have serious discussions. We saw a lot of silly discussions, but not extensive deep dives into the value of infrastructure. That wasn't going to come up in any debates at length. And in any event, I think Canada's evolved our understanding of the need for infrastructure. Unlike 15 years ago, people were saying there's this thing called the infrastructure gap. Let me explain what it is. Means we, in the 80s and 90s, we didn't spend as much and we're behind. Everybody kind of understands that. All politicians, the value of spending billions of infrastructure, and it provides jobs for skilled trades, apprenticeship positions. It's an important mechanism to get people those hours that they need. So I don't think, there was no discussion of it, infrastructure per se. The green infrastructure, of course, there was, but no one is going to dismantle the Liberals' $180 billion Investing in Canada plan. So our stakeholders were hoping for a discussion, but I think it's a given. Although if O'Toole wins, he'll dismantle the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So we'll see how that plays out. Lots of good projects in there now, and a mandate. So
they really are.
Yeah, we'll see where some of those go. It'll just go in the federal department, I guess. Okay, so Mary Van Buren and Ken Lancastle, the mechanical engineers, both talked about the development of a skilled workforce. They're hoping to see support for training and upskilling workers. The just transition is a topic people were talking. A lot of people were talking about. The NDP was talking about it. Liberals. So, and I think the platforms came out. There was the Liberals are doubling union training and innovation program, and they promised just transition legislation. Conservatives, they talked about supporting women getting into skilled trades, a topic we cover a lot. A program called supporting a nonprofit organization, or program called Build a Dream, also Women Building Futures, and they'll double the apprenticeship job creation tax credits. So I think that for those people looking to see a mention of skilled trades, it was in the platforms. Again, I don't think it was talked on at length. Nobody, devoted a day to let's talking about the skilled trades. It's unrealistic to think that, really. Now, here's something I thought. So Darrell Reed of the PCA thought he'd like to see a return to the powerful energy-related export economy that has built this country. So, continuation of support and recognition of the oil and gas sector. And O'Toole, even for all his migration to the center, I saw during the debate he had some comments on that. He said, when it comes to leadership, our natural resources sector is a leadership in environmental, social, and governance. When Canadian resources are removed from the supply chain, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia fills that gap. So he's let's get our emissions down and Canadian resources to market. So
do you think, though, that I understand where the stakeholders are coming from or Darrell was coming from when saying that, because obviously for the construction industry and out west and everything, oil and those resources still play a very large role, and they are trying to be more cognizant of the environmental impacts. There's carbon capture technologies being developed in various industries and whatnot. But on the conversely, maybe O'Toole mentioned it a little bit, but you had pretty much every other party saying, yeah, that's it would almost be like you're shooting yourself in the foot to bring up the word pipeline. So, you had Anna May Paul saying, basically, no to pipelines, but there's still a lot of number of projects out there. So it's kind of, I'd say from a political spectrum, a very delicate, almost a delicate topic based on what's happened in the last few years.
Yeah, that's for sure.
In a way, it kind of saved Trudeau and the Liberals to a degree. You know what I mean? The fact that the focus is on so many other obviously major issues that we're dealing with.
Sure.
Yeah, but Russ, you've written about it, like the pipeline stuff around Trans Mountain and everything out west. Like, talk about a political hot potato and something that doesn't reflect too well on this government, the way it's kind of played out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, I talk to people in Alberta, and they're hurting bad. And as a prime minister, you don't want to ignore that. But also, in BC, right next door, you have people who are just really, really against expanding the Trans Mountain pipeline. That's still, like, even just in the past few weeks, people have been protesting it and getting involved in that. And that's still like a really hot issue. But yeah, like you said, and especially with Alberta again, with the rising numbers, I mean, it kind of refocused the election, I think, on the pandemic and left little room to kind of talk about those issues. As Jason Kenney went on TV and had those new measures in place and had to change course. I think that definitely brought things back to the pandemic for sure. But yeah, Alberta's hurting. They want their energy industry to be healthier. Um, but they also, at the same time, I talked to Bill Black with the Calgary Construction Association. He said, at the same time, we want a diversified economy. We don't want to be at the mercy of, a single industry, when oil prices drop, when things kind of dry up. We want to be able to have, other avenues of revenue, other ways to stimulate the economy. So, yeah.
And to Alberta's credit, I do think that there is some big industries playing and taking up shop there. We just had a story today. Actually, sorry, it's coming out, so stay tuned. No, it was today. Sorry, on a $700 million solar project. It's going to be the largest solar farm ever built in Canada. That's
Wow.
a huge renewable energy resource. So I do think, and that's going to employ a lot of people as well. I think Alberta is trying to diversify, on to some extent, but there is a stigma as well as a reliability on oil still. So, kind of like you said, Vince, a little bit of a political hot potato there. Where can you sit and what can you say, basically?
Well, I wonder, like, we've done the stories in the past, and in past election, even the last federal election, we talked about the conversion of the labor force, in particular out west, from the oil sands, turning them into green jobs and that retraining that's required, right? Those were discussions we were having regardless of an election. As the economy, there was a downturn in the economy, and then when things picked up again, and the boom and bust kind of cycle that everyone's used to, that's not news to anybody who's listening to this that's involved in construction out west. But there was hardly to no mention, you know what I mean, of that type of stuff right now. Maybe if you got into the nuances of the policy, you would see some stuff, but never a talking point, really. You know what I mean? Maybe you heard the term green jobs a couple times, but nothing really concrete, right?
No. Actually, with that, Russ, why don't you dive into what some of the stakeholders wanted out west?
Yeah, it's kind of a laundry list of things that we are always writing about, and I'm sure my colleagues have been mentioning as well. Workforce development. I mean, we're reaching a demographic cliff, as one of my sources said. I mean, a lot of older people in the industry are retiring, and they're not getting replaced immediately. They're having a harder time finding people. So that has a lot of people in the industry terrified, because what good is all this work if there's nobody there to help you build it, if you can't find anybody? And so one of those things is, Chris Gardner at the ICBA said, well, one of the only relief valves we have is immigration. So they want to see more immigration to help bolster our workforce. So that's one thing. Also, prompt payment. Some provinces have it, but I think some of the stakeholders in BC and Alberta want to see a more national push to make prompt payment the law of the land. That's still a big issue. Getting paid when you work is still a problem in the construction industry, and that was definitely mentioned. You also have permitting. In BC, especially in places like Vancouver and Burnaby, it can take longer than it takes to build the project to get the permits through the process. And so, I mean, when you have one of the biggest issues, because I think one of the top issues during the election was like affordability and like cost of living, and a huge part of that is housing. And if you can't get these projects built, quickly, that probably contributes to that. And so I think a lot of the people in our industry are frustrated that, maybe they want to build projects, but it takes a very, very long time in certain jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions are doing better than others. I mean, I know in BC, the one they talk about a lot is Langford. Langford doesn't have as many problems as well as Langley as well on the coast. So that's one thing. Let's see what else here. Yeah, like training is a big thing. Just developing, because it's one thing to say, we want apprentices, we want to train people, but you don't always have those opportunities, and a lot of people in the industry want more opportunities, especially in a province as big as BC, where you often have, especially Indigenous people. If they have to fly down to Vancouver or to go to BCIT in Burnaby, that's a big hardship. You have to take time off work, you have to pay, you have to do all this stuff. And so they want more training opportunities for remote parts of BC, or people who just maybe they have a family, or they work another job and it's just not convenient. So there needs to be more options, I think. That's what my sources are saying.
It's funny you mentioned, actually it's probably the perfect jumping off point to our first feature interview, Russ. You mentioned the item housing. We're going to be talking. We're going to share with you an interview that I did with Andy Manahan of WorkX ID. Andy's still a current editorial advisory board member of the Daily Commercial News. He's the former executive director of the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. He's a consultant with Strategy Corp. His views, as he made sure to make clear, and I'll make them clear, are his own as president of Manahan Consulting Services. So the views that he shared with me in the interview that we're going to share with you are his and his alone. You mentioned housing, because we talked about that when we were trying to find, okay, what element of construction really did get some traction in this campaign, something that's really relatable that we heard at different campaign stops, regardless of the leader who was saying it. Housing came up, and we explored that a bit with Andy. And he'll kind of talk about the interesting nuance that we kind of forget when it comes to housing, that it isn't truly just a federal thing. You know what I mean? That they can provide the carrot, but the actual getting it done, really, you have to look at the provinces and the municipalities. So with that, we'll transition now to our first feature interview of the night. Once again, it's Andy Manahan, president of Manahan Consulting Services. And after he's done, we'll be right back with you all. Hello, everyone. This is Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce, joining you today. And with me is Andy Manahan, President of Manahan Consulting Services, longtime Daily Commercial News Editorial Advisory Board member, and also a Senior Advisor at Strategy Corp. Andy, thank you for joining us on this first ever election night broadcast brought to you by the DCN and JOC.
Great to see you again, Vince.
Yeah, great to see you too. So wanted to talk to you tonight. Now, this is a recording. We're recording during the day. So full disclosure to the viewers, right? This is before the polls have closed, but we're holding this chat during the day because it's going to be a busy night for everybody. And I know you and myself, policy and political wonks. So, we want to have as much attention on the television and the results as possible. But I wanted to talk to you because of the longstanding kind of expertise that you can bring. You've brought it to our readers and our listeners on the podcast in the past around infrastructure and transit and housing investment. So I wanted to get a flavor from you on some of those topics. So I hope you're ready to go.
Okay, I'll give it my best shot.
All right. So really, describe how you think the issue of infrastructure, like what kind of attention has it received? Has it received the attention that one would expect, considering all the other issues that are at play right now during this election campaign?
I would say that infrastructure is a given for the most part. During the pandemic, it was recognized certainly by the Liberal government, but also by the opposition parties that infrastructure investment is really important to get people working again. Other sectors of the economy, such as hospitality and service, were decimated. Construction did relatively well. So I think it was recognized by our political leaders and parties across Canada that infrastructure is really important. So infrastructure really wasn't a priority topic during the campaign. There were other issues that I would say were related to the jobs and economy, and there were certainly differences of opinion on childcare. How do you get more women into the workforce? So those types of issues were indirectly related to economic growth, post-pandemic, and how do we deal with things. Very little talk about transit investment. I think in the spring, certainly when Catherine McKenna was infrastructure minister, she did make some announcements about, the 4 priority projects in Toronto, and certainly the Hamilton LRT was a priority for her. Those types of things, and electrification of buses across Canadian cities, those were all infrastructure related, but that talk sort of died down over the last 36 days.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's what we found here too, as we've kind of followed it along, hunting for the construction stories on the campaign. Typically, one of our go-tos is always the debate around infrastructure and transit investment, and gas tax funding for municipalities. That it just never seemed to kind of pick up as a hot topic. You know what I mean? From what we could see on our end.
I would say that housing became one of the top 5 topics during the election campaign, with people using phrases like "this is a housing crisis." Young people are never going to be able to afford, to either own or rent. Most of the platforms were around home ownership, but they seem to be juicing demand rather than thinking more so about the supply side. I'm just saying in general terms. There was some talk, for example, about rent subsidies of $5,000. Talk about foreign buyers tax of 20%. Some of those things symbolically I think are important, but they're not really important issues in terms of increasing supply that's really needed. Even though we have been at a pretty good clip in terms of building, my concern is that once we get out of this pandemic and immigration numbers start trending upwards again, it's going to be even that much more difficult to keep up with the shortage of supply, which is, as it's not really a federal issue. There are certain things that can be done, like the federal government might have some land that they can open up that might be able to encourage through incentive programs municipalities to do things in a different way, but it's really at the local and provincial level where housing policy and delivery is paramount.
You tell you and I have done enough work together and interviewed each other. You beat me to my next question. Nicely done, Mr. Manahan. Well, it was just about that. How much can the federal government really do when it comes to housing? Is it really, are there carrots that they can provide for provinces and municipalities to jump on? Because that's where the rubber hits the road on that topic, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, some of the discussion was around the stress test, and I can understand the concern because, we have seen inflation tick up over the last little while, beyond the Bank of Canada's band of 1 to 3%. We've seen 4% plus inflation. Will interest rates fall at some point with the Bank of Canada? That's a great unknown. But the stress test, again, is another one of those issues that it's important to ensure that people who are entering the housing market for the first time can maintain making the mortgage payments over time. But again, it's not going to generate the kind of supply that's needed. So I can understand, where the governments are coming from with those sorts of questions. But again, that did not really become a hot topic in any leaders' debate or anything of that nature. There was some discussion that, certainly the Conservatives made, and I think they probably tore a page off of, the Ford government in Ontario with respect to linking transit. So, this is transit-oriented communities where a developer would, in return for helping to build a station, would get higher densities around that station. So I think that O'Toole and party picked up on that particular one. The Conservatives also said things about, deferring capital gains for rental properties so that more money would be reinvested in the rental. So that's probably good for economic growth, but it's not really helping housing affordability. It's just, generating more construction jobs. So, it might be good for the developer community to think about it, but for the average individual or the household, you're not going to be lowering rental prices with that kind of an approach.
True. There was a story recently over the weekend where there were some highlights brought to about somewhere in the Maritimes, can't remember, from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, about some housing projects that were enabled by some federal funding of some kind, but they weren't really affordable homes as far as the rent that they were going at.
Right.
But it's everybody can make a lot of points during a campaign, right, off of headlines like that, and but trying to understand a bit more how much a federal government can do versus a provincial and municipal sometimes might be asking a lot of a voter, right? So to understand that.
Well, there's an interesting statistic that I came across. So especially around the GTA with the hot housing market that we've had. And, the average prices have increased over the last 5 or so years from around 600,000 in the GTA to well over $1 million. And to be able to afford that kind of an increase, even if you couldn't afford $1 million house, you'd have to have an annual income growth of 18%. So, the housing price escalation far outstripped the ability of people to afford that housing. So, the bank of mom and dad in some cases helps, but, that's a small slice of the overall solution.
No, for sure. And was there anything that surprised you as far as on the platforms on this topic of housing? Like I'm thinking about the Conservatives as well. We're kind of targeting foreign buyers. That was a bit of a hot topic once. But was there a plank or anything that under the housing initiative that kind of caught your eye from any of the parties? Something that was
if I recall, the Liberals were talking about a rent-to-own program. I think O'Toole tried to use this as a wedge issue because I don't really think the Liberals were planning this. But O'Toole said we'll never place capital gains on your primary residence if you sold it. Because I think the Liberals were making comments with respect to, those people who are flipping and perhaps not intending to stay in that residence. So, some of those things get taken out of context, during a debate just for, argument's sake.
And then as far as the debate too, I mean, it's a question we've been asking people we've been talking to. For yourself, as an expert in the field, did you get anything out of that federal leaders debate, the English-speaking one? And we're just kind of getting the pulse from people that we've talked to. Was it substantive enough? Was there anything in there for you?
Well, there seemed to be a general consensus that the English debate was probably the worst of the three leaders debate, and the one that was probably more damaging to the Liberals may have been the moderator's question with respect to Bill 21, which is in the courts right now. So, that's going to play out over time, but it was certainly used by the Bloc Québécois as something that could be used to help the Quebec nation, so to speak.
Right.
So, in terms of the dynamics of the parties, I think in early September, the Conservatives were a little bit ahead, and O'Toole was trying to become more moderate on certain issues like gun control, and maybe even the climate change policy in terms of the targets and so forth. And I think his base didn't really follow him, and so some of those people, I believe, shifted to the People's Party of Canada, the purple signs that we've seen here and there across the landscape. 7% across the country, 10 to 11% in Alberta and some of the prairie countries. And to me, we could go on and on and on talking about, specifics of policies, but I think emotions ran this election more than anything else. And there was a lot of anger and frustration. I was down in Niagara Falls on the weekend, and, driving into the falls, I saw a street corner with people holding up purple signs. One of them which read, stop the madness. And I completely, empathize with that kind of frustration. What I don't adhere to is kind of, the anti-vax, or, Max Bernier certainly said, I'm not going to support mandatory vaccines or, vaccine passports. And for whatever reason, they seem to catch on. So for the Conservatives, I think PPC is, probably going to, it depends on the riding and the regional breakdowns, but it certainly takes some of the Conservative votes away.
Funny, in our lifetime, we've seen the right eat itself once already in Canada. Think back to the days of, Stockwell Day and the Reform Party and the true breaking of the progressive conservative brand at the federal level, and the Harper conservative rising. And it's interesting to see it. Here we are almost at the precipice of that cycle again. It feels like it a little bit, right? Like the right is starting to eat itself again, but this time it's actually, yes, okay, I'm going to give you my opinion. And it's a bit more of the extreme right that seems to be eating the core conservative now, right? And it's funny to see that twice already, so soon in our lifetime. And then, I mean, what does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, certainly, I think it was in London, Ontario, where that person threw pebbles at Justin Trudeau, and I think all the party leaders, rightly so, came out and said, there's no place for that in Canadian politics. We may have major disagreements, but name calling and stone throwing is not really part of the Canadian way.
Yeah. It is, and maybe that's probably the disheartening part. I know it's not really, for our construction eyes, they probably will rail against us, saying, "What do you mean? You're missing the points," And but it isn't the way we do things. But they would tell us, "No, this is the way it has to be done now because we have to be listened." And it's been interesting to see, and it's been interesting to see how construction's been trying to deal with it, because we do see a bit of a divide between the owners and the guys on the ground on site on certain issues, especially around vaccinations. In fact, we've had some comments sent our way because we ran a poll via our social media, the DCN and JOC social media, just around mandatory vaccinations at work sites. And, one of the comments was, "You're rigging the poll to, to make this happen, to push this mandate forward. It isn't going to work," essentially, paraphrasing it. I'm like, Lord, if I only thought we had that much power. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Right. We're just getting a flavor, but that spoke to the demographics. You know what I mean? So,
and again, we saw protests in front of hospitals rather than in front of, political offices or Queen's Park or Parliament Hill, that sort of a thing. So, take your protests to where they belong. Don't interrupt people that are trying to do their job in the healthcare sector.
No, exactly. Whether you believe it or not, it's actually happening within those walls and those, ERs and with the ICU beds. The strain is there. You know what I mean? So, well, back to our topic. I know people are listening to us for the construction, and so, but this is in a microcosm. This is our conversation we just had right now. Is the challenge these parties and these leaders have had.
Absolutely.
With this campaign, right?
Yeah.
Because it's all about pretty much the pandemic and vaccines, and but there's a lot of other issues that drive, and the economy is the big one. The spend.
And I think some of that anger, whether it's PPC or otherwise, came out because, and all the leaders have said this, so it's nothing new, but did the Liberals make a strategic error in calling the election during the pandemic? Trudeau said he needed a mandate, but he seemed to be getting most of his major planks through with NDP support. Obviously, his unstated goal was, securing a majority government, but definitely in hindsight, this was a big risk for him. And who knows exactly what the slices are, of the polls right now and how the seat count's going to line up. But I think it's highly unlikely that Liberals are going to get 170 seats, which is needed for a majority out of the 338. I think the CBC poll that I looked at this morning said that there was a 17% chance of a Liberal majority, a 57% chance for a Liberal minority. So that seems to be most likely at this stage. 25% chance for a Conservative minority, and only a 1% chance for a Conservative majority. So in essence, I think this country is going to be harder to govern post-election because people are going to be angry that, $600+ million looks like it was, wasted in terms of a result that's more or less the same.
Mm-hmm. It is. I can't see it. Just we're having a conversation. I don't see a majority government either way, conservative or liberal. It's just and the ebb and flow, like you're saying, of what happened with the conservative brand and Mr. O'Toole from the beginning to now. Like they've been been weathering a bit of a storm. You know what I mean? Opinion wise and popularity wise, the last week and a half. So any inroads they would have made, I don't see it happening.
So they're roughly at 31% each, but the seat count is probably going to differ more dramatically than that percentage.
Right. Oh, interesting. So, in the end, do you think there was a moment at all during this campaign where the fortunes turned for any of the parties? We kind of talked a little bit how things changed a bit for O'Toole, but how about for Trudeau and Mr. Singh? Did you see any moments that were their pinnacle moments and then things kind of changing for them, good or bad?
Yeah. I mean, the Green Party had already shot itself in the foot with their internecine warfare before any of the leaders' debates. So I think that was unfortunate. And the Greens couldn't even, muster up candidates in all 338 ridings. I think it was 230 something. But if you watch, Annamie Paul during the debates, she came across in a very articulate way. So, in hindsight, if they had got their act together, they probably would have been a little bit stronger. But I'm trying to remember what their polling is, but it's something like 3%. So, whether they hang on to their 2 seats or not, so they're not going to really make a big difference in this particular campaign.
It's true. I remember during that debate, it was the impression I came away was she had done exceptional. You know what I mean? She just jumped on. With the opportunity she had, she jumped at it and she was articulate. She made her points across. The exchange between her and the Bloc was a little interesting as well. How you may want to interpret the question or not, and her reaction to it all. But it felt that we're back to the format, talking about that debate format. There wasn't the big counter punch that could happen, because at times I found all the leaders were debating the moderators instead of each other, right? And I felt we kind of were cheated as viewers.
That's right. Yeah.
So, all right. So as we wrap up,
climate change, because it is go ahead.
Yeah, climate
change. Should have been the big issue, and there's infrastructure overlap with that particular one. But again, it was relatively nuanced. The Liberals said we'll cut emissions 40 to 45% below the 2005 levels by the end of this decade. NDP said, 50% below current levels or 2005 levels by 2030. And the Conservatives said we'll stick with the Paris Agreement, which is a big change because, so to me, that was, O'Toole was trying to bring the party along with respect to carbon pricing. May not have been the best plan or most fully thought out plan, but certainly, he appeared to be more enlightened with respect to something needs to be done. Canadians want to see things done with respect to protecting our environment. This particular summer, there was wildfires and droughts and all those sort of, clues that things are not really normal, and they haven't been normal for a while in terms of, temperature increases. So, what are they going to do about it? I thought that could have been, a better debate in terms of how do you link, more resilient infrastructure and dealing with, the climate issues.
For sure. And actually, you just reminded me, there were 2 points I'd written down here. Climate change to talk about with you, but as well the second one, just before we go, as we wrap up, the Canada Infrastructure Bank. It has a different fate depending on who wins, right? The Liberals seem to be committed to continuing with it, but the PCs and NDP sound like they would end it. So
they would pull the plug from what they've said. Yeah.
So you were involved, you talked about the CIB, I remember my staff would interview about it. Has it been working in your estimation? Does it deserve a refresh, a restart? What do you think on the issue of the infrastructure bank?
Yeah, the criticism that's come from the Conservatives, from my understanding, is that CIB, you said that you would get more private sector investment. We haven't really seen the level of private dollars come into these projects that we thought. There's some very good projects. agricultural issues in Alberta, electrification of buses, energy in southwestern Ontario, all those sorts of issues. I think they're good projects, but it's taken longer, I think, than people thought. What would the Conservatives do if they came in? Certainly, when I spoke to someone in Andrew Scheer's office, who was the infrastructure critic, said that, what happened with P3 Canada was the question I had. And, so this is the problem. Like, I think you can improve on the Canada Infrastructure Bank rather than dismantling it entirely. So my recommendation would be, and I think that, post-election, this is where the associations and other advocates have to just start knocking on the doors in a big way and try to influence policy. Don't do anything too rash right out of the gates, because we've seen that before. P3 Canada was dismantled in favor of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Would the Conservatives, if they got a minority or whatever, go back to a P3 Canada type of format? I don't know. But when you got whipsawed like that, it's not good for policy certainty, and it's really not good for a pipeline of projects.
For sure. Excellent, Andy. Well, look, thank you so much for making time today on election day. As we mentioned, this interview will run in our broadcast, and if you're seeing it now, you are seeing it run in our live broadcast stream tonight. So we thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Great to see you again, Vince.
Great to see you too. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the DCN and JOC election night broadcast. It's 9:13 Eastern Standard Time. I figure it's a good time for us to check in and see how things are going election result-wise so far. We have 5.2% of polls reporting, and currently the Liberals are leading or elected in 26 ridings, and the Conservatives are in second with 8. Everybody else has big goose eggs, big zeros. As far as the share of the votes cast so far, you're sitting with the Liberals at 42%, Conservatives at 32.7%, NDP at 17.4%, People's Party of Canada, the PPC, at 4.6%, and then the Greens at 2.6%. So there we have it, folks. Right now, very early in this marathon, we got our 2 expected front runners running in front, right? Maybe the Liberal, it's kind of a surprise the Liberals are that far ahead, but it is the Maritimes and Atlantic Canada where they are typically strong. So we shouldn't be too surprised.
Also, keep in mind they don't have the mail-in votes are not in yet either. So
yeah. And those aren't going to get counted. They're not going to start counting those until tomorrow anyways, the last I heard, right? So so it's interesting. So I hope people enjoyed that interview with Andy. He kind of went around the horn on some provincial issues, some national issues. The one that really jumped out was about housing. But before we get into that and we get into a bit more analysis from Angela, as she describes what she heard from stakeholders here in Ontario around the key issues, I just wanted our listeners and viewers, if you want to reach out to us, if you're from the industry and you want to jump in on something you've heard, a topic we've been talking about, you want to correct us on something we've been talking about, by all means, you can email me at vince.versace@constructconnect.com. Once again, that's vince.versace@constructconnect.com. Let me know that you want to jump in and join us here in the live stream, and we'll patch you through. We'll talk to Warren and get you through on here. And as you notice, I mentioned my email. In our opening remarks, I failed to mention, and I'm going to mention them now. This is brought to you by Construct Connect, our company. Not to sound like a commercial, but they're the ones that have put full faith in us to kind of roll with it and gave us as much leeway as we wanted in trying to get this idea started and to execute this live stream broadcast. So this is brought to you by Construct Connect, but powered, of course, by the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce and this news team that you see on the screen in front of you. But so let's get back to that Andy interview, and I wanted to jump on. He did talk quite a bit about housing. So, Ange, what did you hear about housing from? Because that's the one issue that seems to be the heaviest construction-related issue that was coming up.
Right. So I spoke to provincial stakeholders in Ontario just days after the election was called, and the reaction from them was really mixed. But it's funny that Russ was talking about stuff going on in BC and Alberta, and I mean the wants and the asks are really the same in Ontario. That's what I gathered anyways. So I'll start with Richard Lyle from the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. He was really vocal about the housing issue and affordability. He is usually, and definitely more during the election. So while he didn't think the election should have been called during a global pandemic, he did say that the one good thing that came out of it was that it would bring awareness to this issue of the housing crisis in the province and the country. And it was, I mean, we're talking days after the election, and he kind of called it before it even became a big issue, and all the other candidates started talking about it during their election stops. So it was a huge issue. And then he also said that he had supported the Conservative Party platform. Again, it was early days, and during that time, no other platforms had really been released. But he said that he supported because it called for more homes to be built. That was his primary goal. And he said the plan recognizes there's a housing supply issue, a housing supply crisis, and it focuses on removing the barriers. So I was hearing that from other stakeholders as well in Ontario.
Yeah, it's interesting. Richard's been speaking to that, I would say, for a long time now. And he's also been talking about something that you mentioned, Russ, with regards to the permitting process, and how that's a really big barrier to things. And moving things electronically across this province. Vince can speak to this, I know. We have some initiatives going on with that, but he's been beating this drum for a long time. So yes, I think you're right, Ange. It was early days when the Conservatives kind of came out with their thoughts when it comes to housing and their platform. I am interested to get your guys' reaction to this. Like, the Liberals have also, they've had the Rapid Housing Initiative investing $2.5 billion prior to this election call. They've obviously reiterated it in their platforms. They want, to see 1.4 million homes built, or at least upgraded by 2025, 2026, something to that effect. And then you have, as you said, Ange, the Conservatives kind of putting it out there, and the NDP then saying, 500,000 affordable homes over the next 10 years. Like, this is something that was really prominent throughout the election campaign. But it was something that's been a long-standing issue. So my question that I would pose to you guys is why do you think it's such a hot button topic now? Because it's been out there for a while.
Lindsay, sorry, Vince. I think when you look at the various campaign pledges, it's wise to differentiate between things that are going to increase supply and then things that are going to make things more affordable. So affordability is it's obviously a huge topic, and they segue from housing to other matters. But looking at the Liberal platform, they really are speaking the language of the construction sector. It's obviously, you like a government that consults with people. What do you have to say? Well, we need these measures. So that new housing accelerator fund. I don't know many details about it, but $4 billion to accelerate new home construction, 100,000 new middle class homes by 2024, and then supporting municipalities. I like this one. Okay, so funding to municipalities to grow housing supply faster than their historical average, increasing densification. We hear that all the time.
Speed up approval times.
More public transit oriented development. I think the Conservatives talk about that. So speed up approval times. So that's Lyle was saying that to me last week as well. Like some of the measures in Ontario as well can save years off minister's zoning orders. That's provincial jurisdiction as well. But we've got to cut years off the approval time if we want to get these houses built in the numbers that the Liberals are wanting. So I looked at the policies based on what's good for supply, and then sure it's great to talk about affordability, but two different questions, I think.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. And the current climate, I'm just interested, it's just the current climate of things when it comes to affordability. Obviously, there was a lot of things in the platform appealing to that, but for our industry, it's about getting the shovels in the ground with a number of a number of aspects. But anyway, Vince, you were going to say something. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, like, to kind of jump in on the question you said, why? You asked why, and real estate's and the affordability of homes in this country. It was a hot topic, in commercial media. Everybody's been talking about it. It's like, can young folks afford a home? You know what I mean? Like that movement of people coming back home to save money so they can finally purchase their first home. That was something that was being written about, right? Then you had the foreign buyers and their influence in markets like Vancouver and in Toronto and Montreal to a degree. Then you look at stuff like Alex Carricker, chief economist, when he talks about real estate, not necessarily about residential, but commercial vacancies, what's ready to go, what isn't. I mean, it's been top of mind. And like Russ has talked about before, even when we were kind of, while the Andy interview was running, take away the pandemic from this election. You know what I mean? I truly believe there are certain topics that would have been planks for everybody to discuss and debate on, right? One, Indigenous issues around whether it's Indigenous infrastructure or social issues around that. Real estate and affordability of homes, is the next one. Like, I think those are two things that were going to be discussed regardless, right? I don't know what else they could have done differently. You know what I mean? Because people are concerned about the jobs they lost, keeping the jobs they have, being able to unite with family and friends now, being forced to take a vaccine, yes or no, right? And I don't know, the fact that housing has gotten the play that it has so far, I'm actually kind of impressed that it actually stayed something that was topical for all the leaders pretty much to discuss, right? So I don't know, Ontario wise, Angela, is there anything else that we kind of, when you were talking to some stakeholders, was the stuff around pipelines? I remember that was a bit topical before everything kind of exploded.
Yeah.
Is there something there still?
One of the issues that kept coming up when I was speaking to stakeholders was for the federal government to get funds flowing to other levels of government and to get more infrastructure built, like we discussed before. So Karen Renkema of the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada, she said, there should be more flexibility for municipalities and Indigenous communities to decide what projects that they should be built based on their, the needs of those communities instead of just focusing on, green infrastructure or particular infrastructure. Then other stakeholders talked about the importance of a long-term infrastructure plan and making sure that there's a pipeline of projects and that, it's important to invest in infrastructure, especially during, this time as the economy is recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts of that. Patrick McManus, who is from the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association, said, the next government needs to establish a better method of getting committed infrastructure dollars spent faster. So that's again speaking to, the need to speed things up and cut red tape. And he said that Canada needs a more streamlined system to determine whether or not certain projects are eligible for federal funding. So also, Nadia Todorova of the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario, she said she's hoping to get the next government will implement a federal water fund to address leaky pipes and crumbling sewers, which they've been talking about for a while as well. They've had a number of reports on that, and so that's kind of their ask of the government. And then Patrick Dillon of the Provincial and Construction Building Trades Council of Ontario saw the election. He's actually the one who saw the election as a positive thing, probably the only one that I spoke to that saw it as a positive thing. And he's hoping the government will make significant investments in infrastructure, which translates into job opportunities, more training, and more apprenticeships. So that's kind of the big picture in Ontario. That's what construction stakeholders are asking for here.
It's very interesting that you jump on that they did all pretty much jump on the fact that there needs to be immediate infrastructure dollars flowing down to the provinces, down to and in turn down to the municipalities and whatnot, because that was a criticism nationally, and I think at West a little bit too. There just seems to be a constant message that yes, there needs to be strategic planning done on these infrastructure projects, but in order to get things done, you got to get the money flowing. And there was a massive infrastructure plan that the Liberals had touted during the previous campaign, and now we're here again.
Always
and
tough for an
there's-
incumbent.
Yeah,
Stuff
always
like that.
stuff.
'Cause
Exactly.
the question is,
So,
well, why didn't you do it, right?
right. Exactly. So, just kind of an interesting parallel to see, because when we covered the last one, this was a big topic of discussion, and it's kind of interesting. It's not to say that nothing's been done, but it's just interesting. And obviously, I think a big ticket item that really could impact our industry is the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And basically, the Liberals are the only ones who want to keep it around. So if that gets axed, what happens? I mean, that's a pretty big question to be asked.
It's an interesting question. Like, I mean, I know Mark Romoff, who one of the other feature interviews did for our broadcast tonight, is going to speak to that. And he talked a bit about the infrastructure bank. Depending who you talk to, it can work, right? Has it hit the mark that it was supposed to listen to stakeholders? No, and I think we can categorically say through our reporting that when we've looked at it, it hasn't necessarily built the partnerships that were highly touted in the marketing of the idea of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. That, that there was going to be this line of third party, private people that are going to want to partner with the government to get this stuff built. And when we get to the Romoff interview, I kind of explore that a bit with Mark. Don, you've written about the infrastructure bank a bit. There are projects of interest. There are some bigger ones, some smaller ones. What kind of context do you want to give some of our viewers and listeners about the infrastructure bank and what it's done to date?
Well, do you know what? Some of the skepticism of the pace, so it starts in 2017. There's no way you can't pick up the phone and all of a sudden say, I'll put 1.2 billion into that project. Takes lots of discussions. Projects don't just materialize out of thin air in 6 months. So, but still, people even giving it a couple of years, it still was slow in coming along. Then I think one of the first major projects, the REM of Montreal, the federal government had already committed a lot of money. That's an example of a project. We started talking about that in 2018 or 2017. All of a sudden, stations are going to open in a couple of years, and that's a huge project, $6 billion. So federal government was putting 1.2 billion in. They just handed that file over to the Canada Infrastructure Bank and said that's a CIB project. So that's not what we wanted to see out of this. We wanted to see innovation, green projects. Then some great projects started to come along. You were talking about that at the Alberta irrigation projects, 407.5 million, 8 irrigation districts. I'll mention a couple more here. As it is now, their portfolio looks pretty good. So they're funding that the GO on-corridor expansion project from GO electrification. That's kind of the green projects we all wanted to see come out of this. So the triple lens of any federal investment. So that fits in with this, up to $2 billion they're spending on that. High frequency rail, 55 million, and Calgary Banff rail, just a memo of understanding. So things were coming along slowly but surely, but one point that O'Toole has made, he no longer wants to see the green lens on projects.
Yeah.
He's talking about, well, let's create jobs. So, talking about moving forward versus moving back, I would say that's a step back. For defining the directions of those two parties on this policy in particular. So then there's all the.
Sorry,
one more thing. Then there's their retrofitting mandate, 2.5 billion maybe out of that. Handed a mandate just to keep them busy. Great new manager from Infrastructure Ontario. So I think it is finding its footing, developing a portfolio after a few years, but we'll see. I guess all these projects will be transferred over, as I mentioned before, into Infrastructure Canada.
Yeah, I guess if the Liberals
Oh,
don't
it's
go
interesting.
back in.
Yeah, sorry, I'm cutting you off. It's because it's percolating on top of my head. I've been meaning to say it. It's like, for the people that are not, for the Canadian Council of Public-Private Partnerships Conference every year, we've been a major, stakeholder in it. We produce a daily reporter, and so we've been there from the inception, from when the idea was even being floated about some kind of agency being bank. And as you guys have seen through your reporting, you've seen over the last few years, the issues that the free sector, which then in turn is what CIB has been dealing with, is worried about liability, and a project risk and liability. It's like, why should I be stepping up and exposing myself such? And that's been one of those issues they've been dealing with as well, in trying to attract those partners. And attracting those partners takes work. And on the screen now, it's not just about an agency like CIB having to work with the feds or working in P3 realm, and working in the context of a federal election and what's right. You know what I mean? And what happens and what's the process. And our next feature interview, and I think Warren can give you a bit more insight into that. We actually spoke with somebody ahead of an association. And I'm just going to give the viewers a bit more.
Hello, everybody. Warren Fry, digital mediator with the Journal of Commerce and Daily Commercial News. And with me, I have.
Hi, Warren. I'm Chris Atchison. I'm president of the BC Construction Association.
And we're here to talk about how this election is going to affect, one way or the other, the construction industry in BC and nationally. I guess I'd start with this has been highly criticized by a couple different parties for being called during a pandemic. How do you think the pandemic has affected this election, if it has at all?
Yeah, I think the pandemic has definitely affected this election. I think in the provincial election that we held, we saw an NDP government capitalize on good timing, because the public opinion on the way they were handling the pandemic at the time was relatively strong. I think there was a miscalculation on behalf of the federal Liberals, that they maybe thought that we're going to take maybe a page out of the playbook here in British Columbia, and it couldn't have worked out differently. And I think that there is like I said, it was a miscalculation, and I think that they misread the overall Canadian sentiment about their handling of the pandemic and their timing of this election.
And conversely, I don't know if Jason Kenney's apology is going to do any favors to our Aaron O'Toole. We don't know yet. We will tonight, I suppose. But that is another. Not that was Aaron O'Toole's fault. He didn't really call the election. So, but this is it sort of illustrates what you're saying about how these factors come out of nowhere that people can't control.
Well, absolutely. And we're if you would have called this election or anticipated this election in early July, it might not have been so bad. But the way things materialized in August, and maybe the election train was already well predetermined by then. But we're tired. Canadians are tired. Industry is tired. We've proven resilient time and time again, in order to keep our businesses afloat, in order to keep our workers safe, in order to keep our families together. We don't need an election at this time in the midst of a fourth wave.
And well, we are having an election regardless. So, and whoever is in, you like we've talked about off air, you're going to have to deal with them. So, what are some issues you want to see addressed, no matter who gets in?
Yeah, absolutely. And no matter who gets in, there's going to be a role for construction in Canada to play. And, Canada is well poised to rebound in this country because of the role that construction will continue to play following the COVID-19 pandemic. But, I guess what we want to say or what we want to see is a continued investment in the infrastructure of Canada. Invest in Canada, invest in Canadians, and invest in infrastructure. That's the mantra that we are falling in line with the Canadian Construction Association. We really believe that should be a commitment made by whoever comes to power, is that to acknowledge the role that our industry has played in preserving some semblance of normalcy during the pandemic, because we've been deemed non-healthcare essential, and because of our safety protocols, we've been able to do and conduct business somewhat as usual, notwithstanding some disruptions to supply chains, et cetera, and some cost escalations. But we've been able to see the industry to some extent withstand some of this, where other sectors have struggled more, and we've been there to try to support them where we can. But there's $141 billion annually that goes into the national economy as a result of the construction industry across Canada. And on the national level, we're 7.5% of the national gross domestic product. So with those numbers in mind, we want to make sure that we're dialoguing with the incoming government to make sure that they are working with us to plan for the future and to invest in infrastructure, not just 1 year at a time, but decades at a time.
That you mentioned infrastructure, and that makes me think of a couple of certain candidates have said we want to get rid of the infrastructure bank. What do you think of? Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea?
Yeah, it's really we haven't seen the benefits of the infrastructure bank as maybe as prevalent as we have or as it's been in other areas of the country. So I don't really have a comment on that. I think it can work. Maybe it just needs a little bit more of a tweak. But whatever whatever party comes to power, they're going to have their own mind made up on that, and we will work with it if it can work with us.
Mm-hmm. And just in terms of the economy, day one when this party gets in, conservative or liberal is most likely, but either or, what are the key economic priorities they've got to handle besides obviously the pandemic? There's probably other ones as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we've mentioned a commitment to investment in infrastructure. That's got to be maintained. We need to develop a plan, and we need to develop a plan hand in hand with that with the incoming party. But I think it needs to be said that we are facing a tremendous skills shortage, and the disruptions to the workforce in Canada are being felt in a number of sectors. And there is a significant need for our industry to be reckoned with, and to, because we need that workforce. If things need to get built, we're going to need the workforce to do it. The construction industry should be seen by Canadians as a high opportunity occupation. And too often we've been marginalized, and it's kind of that last choice of people who can't make it in other sectors. We need to turn that perception on its ear and point to these amazing careers that people can build from a young age towards retirement in many facets of our industry. And I think by celebrating what is good about our industry through a national program, through provincial programs that can help to change the attitudes around our culture. And we've got work to do ourselves. And I think everyone on our side is prepared to roll up our sleeves and say, we are doing what we can, but we need the help of the federal and provincial governments to make sure that they are recognizing that these jobs pay well, they provide great benefits, they provide portability across the country in terms of labor market downturns. They are skilled professionals who can do this work, and it doesn't get solved by just bringing in the mandate for quotas. on different construction projects. That's not a way to build up the, to build up the, the sentiment that these are the high opportunity occupations instead of the necessary fallback occupations for communities who otherwise might not be best served in our industry.
Now, it's a federal election, but it's been said that BC might be what turns the page one way or the other. Like we might be the votes that change that. So, as somebody who's representing BC interests, in a sense, what do you think BC should get out of this thing, one way or the other?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think all indications are that BC will be. You always hear in the American election swing states. Well, I think we're a swing province this time around. So I think the outcome of this election is going to mean that there's certain priorities that we have, again, with regards to the provincial economy, the role that we've played in keeping BC strong and vibrant and an important part of the national fabric, and the role that construction has played in that. I mean, we have been a huge success story, not only in terms of the role we've played in safety during COVID, but the continuity of our workforce, the safety of our workforce, and the need to see more investment come our way to make sure the procurement is done well. We haven't got prompt payment resolved yet in British Columbia, so there's a national commitment, but that hasn't materialized or manifested itself on the ground in British Columbia. So we will want to see that the federal government parlays what it's done in Ottawa with regards to prompt payment legislation, and make sure that all of our contractors in British Columbia can get paid fairly and on time for the work that they've done. There is, we've talked about the economic impact that we have for our provincial GDP, let alone our federal one. And there is so much money that's being left on the table. There is so much loss of revenues because of risk mitigation that small contractors are facing. So we need to be better. We need to be better managing the industry and manage it fairly in a way that encourages the businesses to set up shop here and to thrive here, not just try to find a way to scratch out an existence, because prompt payment legislation will go a long way to kind of make sure that the taxpayer dollars go further.
Now, BCCA has been sort of at the forefront, at least here provincially, of sort of pushing for diversity and pushing for, ending bullying on job sites and just changing attitudes. What kind of support have you gotten federally up to now, and what would you like to see post-election day on that front?
Yeah, federally, so we have great relationships on the workforce front with CICC or IRCC, in Ottawa, and we work with them on our Integrating Newcomers program, working with pre-approved newcomers to Canada who are still in their home country, who have experience in the construction sector, and we give them the labor market information so that they can choose British Columbia and that they can come to work in our sector. So some of these things are already underway. We're looking to expand that model. We'll work with the provincial government as well to make sure that we can build upon the successes we've seen for a newcomer program. We want to see more investment in apprenticeship training. Those dollars that need to flow from Ottawa down to the province so that we can have effective labor market programming. We need to see an investment in the training seats for apprenticeship. We need to make sure that we're building both the skills and the reputation of our workforce. So, and the labor force shortages aren't going to be solved by our, our current population. We're going to have to see a net in migration, and that will include new Canadians to help fill the gaps in our sector and other sectors as well.
Okay. Now, let's say the Liberals, there's a certain continuity of government there because they've been in charge for the past 5 years. Let's say somebody else wins. What would you say would be the things you'd say, okay, this is what you have to immediately hone in on in order to help out our industry?
Yeah, well, we've talked about making sure that they know that there are there are definitely supply chain issues that are going to affect the productivity and the resilience of the Canadian economy. And I would say that they'll need to pay attention to those aspects to make sure that our construction continuity is maintained. So let's not just say construction's okay, let's leave it alone. There are other factors under the surface that could still rear up. We've mentioned prompt payment. We've mentioned investment in the workforce. We do think that all of those things are going to be a huge priority. And also to refresh, if it's a new government, let's look at refreshing government's approach to fair and open procurement processes as well. Procurement is a big part of what we advocate for here in BC. We want it to be done with full account, with freedom of information, fair, open, and transparent procurement practices from the industry side and from the government ownership side. So we want to make sure that we can address, maybe consider some other uses of delivery models, delivery methods, technology. But let's re-examine this whole approach to procurement, because the amount of dollars, taxpayer dollars, that are going into this infrastructure spend need to be done to the highest level of integrity and account.
Okay, and every single party that I can think of, other than one, says climate change is a major issue, and also the Liberals have up to this point said they've sort of balanced out resources and green concerns. What would you say would be for the next government, them or otherwise, in terms of balancing climate change and the fact that we're a resource economy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we've always been big proponents of this message around building back smarter. There's a great deal of emphasis on green building and infrastructure and climate change. This is important, and but in an era of climate change, when in BC alone, we face over 50 natural hazards, including the big ones like fire, flood, tsunami, earthquake. We also need to start conditioning our industry and conditioning our senior decision makers to build back smarter. We need buildings and infrastructure that doesn't just preserve life during an earthquake, but that are built to be operable within a few days of weeks of disaster. So we need to build buildings that are beyond code, and we need to start receiving that leadership and that type of investment from our federal counterparts. And I know that BC is making some strides, but we're pushing back. It's not just a matter of green building. That's great, but green rubble is still rubble. So we need to build back smarter with crisis recovery mindset in mind. And these investments in infrastructure, I think we need to be looking at them so as they cannot create additional risk. They need to be built for the future. So we would want the new government to come in with a fresh outlook on building back smarter using technology and innovation.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Warren.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the DCN JOC election night broadcast. That was Chris Atchison, head of the British Columbia Construction Association, in that feature interview. And just before we dive into some of the issues that maybe Chris spoke of that our team can give you a bit more context to and perspective, figured we do a check-in, because as we start to move across Canada slowly but surely, the numbers are changing. And it was just about 40 minutes ago when we first reported to you how the parties were faring as far as election and leading. And quite a bit has changed as far as numbers, because we're starting to get a bit more reporting. We're still sitting at about 7.1% of polls reporting, but the Liberals right now are elected or leading in 66 ridings. You have the Conservatives second at 34, the NDP at 10. Of course, now because the Quebec numbers have started to come in, and this is going to be a major player right now in how the rest of maybe things are going to play out as we get through in Ontario into the west. The BQ, the Bloc Québécois, is sitting with 7. And you have the Greens actually holding firm, either elected or leading in 1. When you look at the percentage or the share of the voting, Liberals still sitting at 42%, Conservatives at 32%, NDP at 16.9%, the PPC, People's Party of Canada, at 4.5%, and the Greens are starting to kind of pick up a little bit from when we last checked in, and they're sitting at 3% of the vote, and the Bloc Québécois at 1% of the vote, but their 1% is resulting in that leading or elected in 7 seats. So is that maybe a harbinger of how Quebec is going to go in general? we'll see. But we were talking BC and we're talking Coushacheson, so I'm throwing it out to the team. What do we want to explore in what we just heard in that feature interview?
Yeah, I mean, you could probably lump community benefits agreements in like a larger kind of broader movement around what you would call social procurement. So not just doing procurement to be like, we need someone to do this for us. So let's set up a process, who can do it for the best price, who's most experienced, yada yada yada. The province of BC, which is led by the provincial NDP, which is very union friendly, is saying we want to use procurement to accomplish certain goals, with indigenous participation, apprenticeship training goals, underrepresented groups, things like that. So they're saying, like, we don't just want this to be a process by which we pick someone to do work. We want it to be a process by which we provide solutions to some of the problems. Like, if we need more workers, they mandate that you have apprentices on the site. And I think the way that it's pitched, which is like, if you go and ask somebody, do you want more indigenous people, more women, more underrepresented groups, more apprentices in the industry? People would say yes. But I think where there's a lot of disagreement in the province is how they're going about doing that. And, like Warren said, some of the open shop people say it's not fair that we can't maybe access the workforce that we want to do these jobs. And I think this raises kind of a broader issue, not issue, but the broader concept of social procurement, which I've actually been reporting on a lot recently, because Indigenous participation is a huge thing. And to be frank, it's a selfish thing for the construction industry. They need the labor. Obviously it's the right thing to do, but it's also the practical thing to do. You have workforces that live near where some of these projects are. And I was talking to someone who specializes in this, and they say that a lot of people react, some people react really negatively when there's priority given to indigenous companies or workers in the procurement process. And he's quick to point out several things. First of all, indigenous participation was not a thing years ago. They were economically kept out of a lot of things. They haven't been allowed to accrue the same assets and capabilities of larger companies who've reaped the benefits from government policies. Also, just breaking it down even to like a lower level of just boots on the ground workers. Everybody says we want more, indigenous people in construction, but the problem is they haven't had the same investment from the government in education, and that's not their fault. And so often you get people who say, I want to be involved in the construction sector, but they haven't had access to the same educational resources as the rest of Canada. And there needs to be effort. A lot of people would say there needs to be effort to rectify that. So it's just kind of righting some of the past's wrongs. Seems to be some growing pain in parts of the industry that's happening right now from the people that I've been chatting with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just to tack on to what you're saying, Russ, I do think to point something out, sometimes it can be construed that the open shop people are not necessarily for the concept of CBAs, but they actually are, some of them making some inroads with their own training opportunities as well. So I just did want to point that out. There has been some efforts made there, so they do feel in some cases they're being unfairly represented. But when it comes to the Indigenous component to things, I've been actually optimistic in of late in terms of some of the initiatives that have been going on within the industry. For example, you just did a great story on a Saskatchewan,
Yeah.
I guess, a group that is solely Indigenous contractors, which is pretty cool. I don't know if you want to elaborate at all on
Yeah.
that, but
So it's a
yeah.
group of majority indigenous owned companies, and their whole goal is to advocate for and educate the industry at large about some of the challenges that Indigenous companies have faced historically. Because again, they'll go to people and say, Indigenous procurement and providing more opportunities and a leg up for Indigenous companies, and then people will react negatively and go, "Oh, that's not fair. We should all compete on the same level." And they'll explain kind of the history of economic abuse that has happened in the Indigenous community that prevented them from participating in the past. And it's just it's a matter of getting them back to the level where they need to be. And so there's a group that's getting together, and their main thing is education around Indigenous procurement, and also they also mentioned that a big part of recent history with Indigenous companies is they've been pitted against each other and competing with each other, and they haven't really historically worked together well in the past. And so this is also a great way for them to kind of be more united in their advocacy efforts. So that's really interesting to see, and I'm definitely curious to see what's going to happen with that group.
I mean, I think we can categorically say, and we've heard Jack Mead say this on the campaign trail a few times, and I know you all personally, as far as a team, and I know we're all on the same page with this. It is, quite frankly, it's disgusting. In a country that is well developed and as well capitalized as Canada is, resource rich, water rich, the state of affairs on the reservations, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of regular social, tools that they have, and infrastructure
Just
on the
clean
reserve.
water.
Just clean water. It's so basic. The fact that, yes, the Liberals have been working their way through those boil water advisories as part of the reconciliation kind of mandate of a lot of different things, and I'm not here to advocate for the Liberals, but quite frankly, at least we've seen some movement on some files. Not enough. They failed in some areas as well, but talking just in the world that we cover, as far as construction, we've seen some movement, and we're starting to see a bit more stuff through the reporting that we're doing. We're starting to see that traction happening. So much more can be done. And when we talk about partnerships, and I think about how strong this industry is that we cover nationally, coast to coast, is why more doesn't happen is frustrating. Because we see this industry mobilize on so many different fronts at times, but there seems to still be a bit of a disconnect. We have this need here in Canada to really connect, this industry to help raise up, or to just help give the opportunity for them to raise up, and create more of these companies, and do the training and just improve the state of affairs on these reserves, to help people. It shouldn't be this way here. I know it's kind of like a Pollyanna thing, but it's the truth, right?
Well,
Yeah, I think it's pretty sad that we just had the other day a news brief online celebrating the opening or a water treatment plant in Shoal Lake, which was a place in northern Ontario near Manitoba border. Basically, they've been under a boil water advisory for eons. Finally, get a road that they wanted in, and then there's this big celebratory thing at the end. These are basic human rights that
Embarrassing.
we should not be like, yay, this finally happened after this many years. That's, as Vince said, it's disgusting.
Part of it is, I think, a matter of communication. First Nations point, there's a matter of trust. I've got a quote from Jagmeet Singh here. So when the Liberals are taking kids to court, that just looks bad. You can stop 109 boil water advisories. A bunch of others pop up. You can say, we're going to commit $6 billion to that. We're going to stop it. And the next term, they keep on extending the goalposts. But, during the debate, Singh has said, how do you restore trust when Indigenous communities suffering injustice continues and it's still broken today? How do you restore trust when you've got a prime minister who one day, says he makes promises one day and takes Indigenous kids to court the next day? How do you restore trust in a company as wealthy as ours, G7 nation in the 21st century? So to the point you were making, Vince, it just seems hard to believe, and then, Singh was in near Rainy River, northwestern Ontario anyway. And we had, making that point, one has to say when it's a question of will, you have to start to question it when we haven't fulfilled our promises after 6 years.
I'll give you a specific example real quick. Is you have Indigenous youth right now who say, I want to be involved in the trades. And of course, the industry's like, yes, that's what we want. I don't think any of us have talked to a single source that would say, I do not want Indigenous people participating in construction. The problem is you have some people coming from communities that have been historically neglected with education. And so they don't have the math or reading or whatever skills. So then they go to take the test to try and get involved in the trades or the unions or whatever, and they can't do it. And that gap needs to be bridged. It's not their fault that their communities were neglected, right? And those people want to participate, and there's a barrier for them. And I think, yeah, I think more probably needs to be done to bridge that.
Look, we're all proud. And it doesn't matter what prime minister we've had in the past in our lifetimes. We like to tout our foreign affairs kind of portfolio and Canada, the big heart, Canada, the peacekeepers. Look how, you know what I mean? We do this, we do that around the world. But quite frankly, folks, we got to be hard on ourselves, and we got to hold, and it's our job too, as media, to hold these people to account, right? It's like, why can't we get this right in our own house? And the extrapolated argument is it's not really our house, quote unquote. We took it from them. We came here, and look at what we left them with, right? Like Russ, I listened to what you're saying, and I remember reporting on it as well. It's like the fact that the basic education isn't provided to them, or the ability to give them the opportunity to learn and to be better equipped so they can take those tests and enter the trades is unacceptable. You know what I mean? And I would love this industry to really step up, at some point and really take the bull by the horns, you know what I mean, in some area, and just fix it, you know what I mean, as best they can in their part of the world and set the example, right? And some of the stuff you're reporting on is maybe the early precursor of them taking control of their own destiny to make it better.
I'm looking on the platforms. They're all talking about
climate change. That's another topic, right?
Sorry, yeah, Vince, you kind of are cutting out there a little bit.
Yeah. Just one more on that point. Look at, comparing the platforms again. At least they all understand there's no, that paternalism is not going to work this time around. So there's discussion of like the Liberals are going to co-develop a new Indigenous urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. The Conservatives are saying for Indigenous by Indigenous housing strategy, and they're going to create a Canadian Indigenous Enterprise Corporation for resource development. The NDP is going to co-develop a national plan for reconciliation. So, at least we're hearing a recognition of, but these things should be co-developed at least.
Yeah, you know what I think is an interesting point that has been raised in a number of articles that I've read by you guys is not only that they haven't been necessarily provided the educational needs to help Indigenous people pursue trades opportunities and whatnot, but conversely to that, they haven't been able to educate our industry about what is important to them when it comes to procurement, design concepts. They're more than happy to be, I say they, but Indigenous people want to be part of P3s, for example. There's a number of companies out there that are some involved in P3s, but some that would like to be. But there is a totally different way of discussing, procurement, be it social procurement, be it the cultural elements to it, that I think this industry needs to be a little bit more, have a bit more of a willingness to hear about that. It's not always there's an educational component there as well.
Well, I think there's like some hope on like the project side, because a lot of the reporting I've done over the years, it used to be in some cases, you'd have people develop a project, come up with an idea, and once they're done kind of planning everything, then they'd go take it to a First Nations group and pitch it and try and convince them of this or that, or come up with some sort of agreement. And Indigenous people now are saying, don't do that. We want to be involved from the start. Like, before you go and make all your plans, please talk to us. We want to be involved in the process. And I think I'm starting to see more of that happen, where before all the plans are set in stone, before all the contracts and everything, the ink is dried, like before all that's happened, they're going to Indigenous people and they're saying, okay, let's work on this together as partners, as equals. rather than, you know, trying to get your approval after the fact, right? Which I think that's encouraging to see in some cases. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. I think with, you know, kind of tacking on to that, it's not necessarily the before Vince cut out there, he also alluded to some things on the climate change front, which I think we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss that with regards to the industry. So when it comes to climate change, it's been a hot topic among the party platforms. Been a number of areas and promises made. You know, again, we discussed the greening up, if you will, certain skills sectors and whatnot. But what's been your overall take on the pledges made by the parties when it comes to, you know, climate change, be it net zero opportunities, et cetera? What's been what you think have been some highlights? Anyone?
Well, hopefully my audio doesn't cut in and out, but
Yeah, you
let me
sound
know.
good right now,
Yeah.
Vince. You're sounding good.
Okay, all right. So bear with me, but when we think about that debate, the English language debate, and the discussion when it did come to climate change, right? As disjointed as it was, it could have been a better debate in general. We could discuss that. Everybody wants to talk about these climate, the Paris climate targets, right? You know what I mean? Oh well, the liberals have never hit one. You know, the liberals have never made a target that they've talked about. Oh, they changed their targets. Well, the little thing in the middle of that is, well, they're asked to review their targets and change them as part of the accord, right? It's something that's built into that. A lot still needs to be done. You know, I think there's an argument when they make it against the liberals of you can't be talking climate change and still be supporting the patch. You know what I mean? Still be supporting oil and pipelines if you really want to address climate change. I think the way we cover this industry, we know it's a bit more of a nuanced debate, the nuanced issue. You know what I mean? Trying to transition trades from traditional trades to more green energy jobs. There is work that needs to be done and groundwork around that. Same drum from an hour ago. I think if it's not a pandemic election, I think we're talking a lot more detail. We're talking a lot more about climate change in a way that really wasn't addressed. You know, like Angela, when you were talking to like the Ontario folks, did that stuff come up around climate change at all? Like, or some of your interviews that you've done in the past on this side? Like, it doesn't feel like it has as much traction here on this end of Canada as it does in the West, but I could be wrong.
No, they didn't touch on climate change at all, which I thought was interesting. The main focus was definitely they were concerned about the pandemic and how you know, to get out of it basically, or to recover from it, the economic recovery. And like I mentioned before, the pipelines, the pipeline of projects coming through and spending infrastructure dollars faster and getting things built faster. There was no talk about even of the other kind of pipelines at all on my end in Ontario anyways. I'm not sure how it was out west.
You know, it's interesting too, to talk climate change also means to talk energy efficiency and building retrofits and conversions of things and whatnot. That is highlighted in a couple platforms with regards to, you know, again, going back to housing, it's lumped into that, but it does play a role on reducing, you know, impacts on climate change. So it's kind of interesting to see this spin that sometimes gets put on some of this stuff. I know I've seen it in a lot of more of the recent articles we've done on innovation in the industry when it comes to retrofits and whatnot, but I'm not sure on where things sit necessarily out west there, Russ.
Well, I'll give you a really specific example. I mean, on the coast, we're already feeling the effects of climate change severely. I mean, look at the Lytton. Every single year we're getting horrific wildfires, and you know, just recently an entire town was wiped off the face of the earth. It was the hottest temperature I think ever recorded in Canada, and that place is gone. And now that they're looking at rebuilding it, they're learning lessons. They're going, well, we want to rebuild this place. How do we rebuild it? And we're talking net zero. We're talking renewable energy. We're talking all sorts of things. And I think that's like a microcosm of what's happening in BC at large, where Vancouver and in other cities are really aggressively trying to get to net zero. with new buildings and doing retrofits and things like that. And yeah, we're already seeing places destroyed because of climate change in BC, and people are coughing on the wildfire smoke and traveling right now. I think recently, like, a bunch of roads were closed because of the heavy rains after the wildfires and because of mudslide warnings. So like our daily lives in BC are already being impacted um, by severe weather, and so I think it's pretty urgent here, and I think that's part of why you have really. I mean, that's part of. There's more reasons why, but that's part of why I think there's really strong activism circles in BC opposing things like oil, LNG, Trans Mountain expansion, things like that. Because you look out your window and you see clouds of smoke, and that's just something that we're living with right now.
We had a recent article in our building, one of our recent features by Gene Sorensen, our correspondent, and it was about how there is the technology and there is the building products and the materials to build better, to build smarter. And all these wildfires and these early effects of climate change, people want to deny it. The science is there, but we can talk about arguing science versus what people believe in on a couple of different topics. That's not for this live stream.
Sure.
It can happen. You can build better. You can build smarter in response to climate change and also to improve the climate. But do you want to invest in the cost? How do you incentivize the actual companies that are building, let alone the consumers?
Mm-hmm.
I know from a personal point of view right now, like, I mean, with our family, we're trying to go a bit greener with the power source into our home. We're looking at geothermal. There is a grant program that's run by the feds. I can tell you categorically that program is a mess. In us trying to get an audit done, you know what I mean? So we can qualify for some of those rebates and whatnot. It's a joke. You know what I mean? That great idea, the concept of the idea is great, but preparing the people to execute the program to assist the consumers who are willing to step up, you know what I mean? It's not there. You know what I mean? It just isn't there. And it's like, well, you can't even execute some little thing. And this is a federal program. You know what I mean? How do we address it on a lot more global scale, right?
BC had a
similar
similar
in this
thing.
industry, it can benefit. Is that you saw that there too?
Well, they had a similar program that used to encourage people to, especially indigenous communities that maybe not be as close to, the mainland power grid. And they used to have programs that encouraged developing your own renewable energy. And then they kneecapped it a few years ago and stopped doing it. And so, yeah, it's frustrating. But like you said, I think that's, like you said about the cost, like the technology exists, like carbon capture, things like that exists. They're doing it in Squamish, BC right now. They're building large scale carbon capture facilities, and even geothermal. It works. It exists. The problem is that it costs a lot of money up front. It's a money thing. Like geothermal, to go hunting for a geofield, it's a lot of time. It's risky. The private sector looks at that and they say, wow, that's cool, but it's a lot of risk. It's a lot of money. No thanks. And so I think government has a role where they can incentivize or de-risk that a little bit, especially with things like geothermal and carbon capture, because we know how to do that. That technology exists. It's just a matter of, somebody stepping up and saying, I'll help de-risk it, right?
Yeah. I'm looking at the list. I'm looking at the liberal platform again. I think they've had a pretty good record incentivizing green building now, and so what they some new items. They'll launch a net zero emissions building strategy, aiming to bring net zero emissions from buildings by 2050, and all that goal. We'll create a low carbon building materials innovation hub, and that's been mentioned on the over the past while. So then you look at the electoral landscape tonight. What happens? The Conservatives tacked to the center, adopted their personal savings account. What happens if the Knights come out for O'Toole if he fails drastically in this election? Where do they go from here? Well, is this a failed experiment, or might might the next leader of the party, if O'Toole doesn't survive, take them further to the right. So, this election will have consequences for the loser anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think it's kind of ironic, or I don't know, that's probably not the right word, but during the debate, the Conservatives, the NDP, and whatnot took a real hit, made real jabs at Trudeau with regard to the climate stuff, and how he's missed targets and has done basically nothing, and to fight the climate crisis that's currently out there. But I think their platforms don't seem to be that detailed themselves on plans for climate change, just from what I've read. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that it's such a the term climate change is such a massive, all-encompassing term that it's very difficult to necessarily pinpoint who's going to do a better job at what without really trying to be multifaceted in various components. The construction industry being one of them.
What's the Conservatives' big line that they're doing? They're trying to rebrand as this. It's not your father's party or whatever.
Yes,
right? They're trying to pivot, and I know they've tried to cozy up to unions a bit more, which some of the larger unions were not buying, especially like Unifor was not particularly responsive to that. So yeah, I guess a question is that kind of pivot where they're like, look, we're not what we used to be. We're not your father's, Conservative party. Will that work? I'm not. We'll see.
No, I was going to say we got a couple of things lined up for the next little bit in the live stream here. We are going to get to an interview that I did with Mark Romoff, former president and CEO of the Council of Canadian Public-Private Partnerships. With Mark, we talked primarily about infrastructure, P3s, and just the general climate. We also as housing as well, but also just the kind of his hopes for what comes out of this election, what we hope to see for the industry and for Canada in general. But as we've credit to this team here, as we've been kind of rolling along with our election coverage weekly, we had Lindsay. What was it called? Read My Lips. Was that the segment?
Lips. It sure was.
Why don't you describe a bit to the viewers and listeners what that was about? Because we'll have one roll out just after that.
Well, I certainly can't take any credit for the catchy title. That was all Russ. But it is essentially, we thought it would be interesting every Friday to release a slideshow of sorts of the some interesting and headline-making quotes. And this campaign was full of them. So I won't give too much away. I'll let Warren play or read my lips for you, but essentially it gives you some colorful commentary from the party leaders, whether it's taking jabs at each other or just some overarching highlighting messages. So with that, I'll let Warren take it away.
Hello, everyone. This is Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce, joining you today for this special feature interview, which will run during our election night broadcast, brought to you by the DCN and JOC. I am speaking with Mark Romoff, former President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. Mark, welcome to the broadcast and the feature interview on election night.
Thank you, Vince. Always great to spend time with you.
Yeah, same here. To make clear, as I was saying, full transparency to people that will be catching this interview, Mark and I are talking before the polls close, because we both want to have time to actually watch everything tonight, so uninterrupted. But no, it was just easier to do this way. And Mark, yes, is a former president and CEO of, as I was saying, of the council. But he's not speaking on behalf of them, nor is he speaking on behalf of the current bodies and consulting that he's doing now. Like one of the things being you're on the board of Infrastructure Ontario, you were saying, Mark, but you're not speaking on behalf of Infrastructure Ontario. No. But we brought you here because of your expertise on the file of infrastructure and public-private partnerships and the investment that goes into those two items in the context of this election. I thought you'd be the best person to kind of speak to you around those two topics. So thank you for joining us on that.
My pleasure.
Okay, so I'll start off with that. Is like, describe for us how you think the issue and advocacy around infrastructure and P3 has gone on this federal election, in this federal election campaign. Has it registered on the radar for you? Have they paid enough attention to it, the leaders?
Yeah, well, let me set the scene a little bit if I can. I mean,
Yep.
first of all, my sense of it is that every government around the world recognizes the importance of investing in public infrastructure. Right? They all know that this kind of investment, without a doubt, grows the economy, it creates jobs, it stimulates productivity, and maybe most importantly in a Canadian context, it really enhances a country's global competitiveness. And these are really important economic measures, certainly in Canada. And so from that perspective, all of the parties would clearly endorse the importance of investing in infrastructure, right? How we do it, different views around that, without a doubt. But the reality is that it is absolutely key, and no more so as we're hoping to put COVID behind us and very much focusing on economic recovery. So I think it's a given that infrastructure is important. What's interesting is that when you look at the platforms of the parties, there's a little mention of infrastructure, not a lot. I mean, some of it is overt, a lot of it is covert. Right. And so what I find interesting is that, in fact, there has been no specific reference to infrastructure. You don't hear the word in the campaign. It was never mentioned in any of the debates. And you don't see it as a term that's quoted in media coverage. And yet the reality is that it's probably the most important element behind the curtain, if you like, for all the issues that have been raised during the campaign. So when you think about what people or what the leaders and what candidates are talking about, it's things like affordable housing, right? Everyone talks about affordable housing. The need to really grow out our broadband coverage across the country, so digitizing the Canadian economy. It's about the importance of public transit as a driver of productivity. We hear lots about climate change and green technologies and net zero emissions. It's at the heart of so much of the discussion that's taken place. And we're also, of course, hearing about the needs of Indigenous peoples around Canada. Yeah, part of it is reconciliation, no doubt, but as you and I both know, Indigenous communities have huge infrastructure challenges. The council did a survey a few years back, and just for First Nations alone, that Indigenous or infrastructure gap was pegged at around $25 to $30 billion. And that survey is a while back now, and it's only for First Nations, not counting other groups. So you know that these are big issues that are being discussed right now by all the candidates, and yet the solution or the way in which you address most of these issues is around investing in the needed infrastructure. So without a doubt, if we talk about affordable housing, then launching a real housing plan in Canada is going to be anchored in making those kinds of public investments in order to make it happen. And that goes for all of the, I believe, I have a bias, obviously, but I believe for all the issues that have been raised in the campaign, there's an undercurrent of infrastructure investment that will be key to realizing what the various parties are hoping to achieve over the course of their mandate. Yeah, they'll approach it differently. We can talk a little bit about that, but I think it's at the heart of it all. And so that's the key here. And the other thing too, I think you hear it almost in every public speech by the candidates. They're talking about the importance of partnering with all levels of government, with the provinces, with territories, with municipalities, with Indigenous communities. The importance of partnership in order to enable these various issues to be addressed and addressed with impact. And that, while it's not public-private partnership, the concept of partnerships is at the heart of exactly what we're talking about. So from my perspective, while it's not out there as an issue that people can relate to, it in fact, as I said, is sort of, behind the curtain. That's what's really taking place here in order to enable all of the big programs and initiatives that the leaders are promoting. That'll be key to enabling them to realize them.
Right. How about an issue that, because we're kind of a bit more in a bubble with the publications that we are in your former role, around the Canada Infrastructure Bank, its future. You listen to the Liberals, they did pay some attention to it. They would continue with it, but we have the NDP and the Conservatives that say they would pull the plug.
Yeah.
Where do you sit as far as the infrastructure bank? What needs to be done? Does it need a reset? Does it need its plug pulled? Or where do you stand with that? From how do you see it? I mean,
yeah, it's a good question, because again, it's caught up a little bit in the politics of the day, right? And I get that. But if you think back about what was the rationale behind establishing the bank, I mean, it was quite similar to the rationale behind creating PPP Canada in its day, when the Conservatives were in power. So the intent of the bank, a little more specific, it's about enabling large, complex, much riskier projects to come successfully to market, right? And so no one will debate, I don't believe, with the mandate or the rationale. You need some kind of mechanism to enable these much more complex projects that the private sector might be a little averse to taking on in the same way. So yes, having an entity like the bank or some other mechanism to help reduce the risk, to share in the financial needs in order to enable it to come to market, I think pretty realistic reason to have some kind of mechanism. So whether it's a bank or some other vehicle, that's up to the folks in power to decide. I do believe that the bank is at the moment on a very good footing. As you know, over the course of the last year and a little bit, there was a new chair of the board brought in, a new CEO of the bank, changes in the board of directors, a stronger mandate, and more flexibility in terms of the kinds of projects they can engage with, and a particular focus being placed on Indigenous communities, which I have a particular personal commitment to. So I think that at the moment, the bank is on much more solid footing, and we'll see what happens, obviously, in the election, and then what decisions are made around the future of the bank. But I think irrespective, you do need a vehicle like that can work closely with governments around the country and the private sector in order to enable more infrastructure to get built. Because again, it comes back to the point I was making a little bit earlier about the importance of infrastructure. We all get that. Right? So I think you need vehicles like this to partner with the private sector. And the thing I like about the bank, by the way, is it now has a mandate too for unsolicited proposals. And as you would know, Vince, historically, that's not been an approach that's been adopted in Canada, but now it's becoming more and more recognizable as a way in which to bring infrastructure to market. So the bank has that mandate. The government of Ontario, the government of Alberta, they've all engaged now in putting in place policy frameworks to enable unsolicited proposals. So here is an opportunity now for the private sector to bring their intellect, their innovation to the fore. Again, it's public infrastructure, but nonetheless, engaging the private sector in a way that enables them to make a valued contribution to the dialogue around how to advance the infrastructure agenda, I think very positive. So those are general comments.
Right. Well, I think back to some of the past conferences when you were with the council, and near the end, the tenor and kind of, not the tenor, but the topics and the concerns around transferring risk and liability seem to be some of these pinch points in trying to bring some of these projects to bear, let alone interest to bring these projects to bear. There's nothing really in this campaign that's kind of looked at that. You know, it's kind of like driven by the market itself, it seems like, the change, right?
Yeah, that's right. But there's no doubt that, again, no matter how you choose to procure your infrastructure, whether it's in traditional ways or public-private partnerships or new models, and there are new models coming to the market, things like Alliance, other approaches that are out there. Irrespective of that, I think what's really important, again, is we get back to the fundamental issue around how governments engage with the private sector in an open and transparent and partnering way in order to get the benefit of that kind of collective insight and decision making. So I think what you're seeing is that agencies like Infrastructure Ontario, Metrolinx, SAS Builds, others around the country are looking at the model and saying, all right, it's important for us to continually improve it, recalibrate it where necessary in order to ensure that, in fact, we are partnering with the private sector in ways that makes it attractive to them to bid these projects, while at the same time, of course, making sure that we're protecting the interests of taxpayers. And you and I fall in that category, so we have a vested interest in that too. But I think that this commitment to making this process around investing in infrastructure an evergreen one, so that it's in a mode of constant improvement. And I've always felt when it came to P3s, for instance, that projects and contracts got better and better with every contract signed, right? There's always a learning there on the part of both governments and the private sector. And I think that's really constructive and important and positive.
Perfect. All right. Well, as we wrap up, and I'll ask you, I'm sure you don't have to answer. Do you have a prediction for how this is going to turn out? when the last vote is counted, do you want to go down that road or share it with us?
You know, it's I spent the first 25 years of my life, my career as a diplomat, serving Canada's interests on the global stage. And the one thing I learned, which is most important, is that you serve with enthusiasm the party in power. And so for me, all I want is a good, solid election, a positive outcome, and governments that are committed to really making a difference for Canada. And I think they all are committed to that. And so I'm not trying to avoid the question. I just have a much more sort of egalitarian view of the world. And I just want a good outcome. And then I want to see, to the extent possible, parties coming together in a way that's really going to enable us to advance Canada's agenda, because it is really important. And as I mentioned at the outset, coming out of COVID, there's no more important time to get us back on a solid footing. And I'm hoping that this election will enable us to do just that.
Exactly. Well said. And it's for the benefit of all, no matter what the political stripe. You know what I mean? It's a great country, and we got to just keep moving it forward united as best we can, right?
We are very lucky to be here in Canada.
Yeah. All right. With that, Mark, I want to thank you so much. And also, I want to take the opportunity to thank you for the years of partnership and support. For those that are familiar with, the work of the council and the daily commercial news around your yearly conference. We would put together for the last 5 years or so the P3 Daily Reporter, which was the newspaper at the conference. And I wanted to thank you for helping establish that partnership and opportunity. I think we both really benefited from it, and so did the people at the conference themselves. So,
without a doubt, and to be frank, you guys are a class operation, top to bottom, and so it made a huge difference for us because we knew that folks who come to the conference really wanted that kind of feature and update and news. And you guys are so good at that, right? And you did some wonderful interviews on site and virtually last time around. And so it's a huge value add. I mean, again, obviously I've stepped away from that entity this year, but I know that the organizers of the council conference this year feel exactly the same way. So keep it up, man. You're just a great operation. So thank you very much.
No problem. I'm sure you're going to keep up bringing that expertise that you do all the time and that passion, whichever file you're on. So with that, Mark Romoff, everyone, thank you very much.
Thank you, Vince.
Take care.
We'll talk again after today.
For sure. Sounds like it. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great chatting with you.
Great talking to you. Bye. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the DCN JOC Election Night broadcast brought to you by Construct Connect. So a lot changes. We come back from these breaks and we're looking at the numbers as a team, and it's incredible the things that we see. Just as we headed into that break, we started to see the early prognostication and call for, and it came via CBC News, them projecting a Liberal government. So now, as of 10:42 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, this is where we sit with 18.7% of the polls reporting. We have the Liberals leading or elected in 151 ridings, the Conservatives sitting in second at 117, the Bloc Québécois at 28, the NDP at 27, and the Greens sitting at 3. As far as percentage of the vote, and this is interesting with the numbers because now we're starting to creep into that danger area for the Liberals. This is amazing, and we will get into this discussion. I'm anxious to hear what you folks have to say. You need 170 for a majority, and they're on the path there. But during the break, Warren, you said it, and a few other people said it too. It's like, this is the hard part. This is the hard 25 for them to win. And when you look at the share of the vote, it's tightened up since the last time I reported to you all. The share of the vote, you had the Liberals at 42%, and the Conservatives were at 32.8. But here we are, 45 minutes later, the Liberal share of the vote's down to 35.8%. The Cons now are at 33.2. NDP is at 16.3% of the vote. The Bloc Québécois has eaten up 6.7% of the vote. PPC, People Party of Canada, is at 4.9, and the Greens now dip back down to 2.3. There's a number here I want to share, and this is courtesy of the CBC. So these aren't numbers that we're doing on our own, but I'll call them up during our discussion just about the gains and losses so far. But anybody else really surprised? Where do we sit? 150. You know.
Yeah, I agree with Warren on that one. I wasn't anticipating as much red as we're seeing right off the hop. I was expecting a little bit more of every poll essentially said they were tied or close to being tied. As there is still hurdles to be had for the Liberals, as we're talking about and whatnot. So it still could be as close as we're called. But to have major news organizations already proclaiming a Liberal government, obviously we don't know minority majority, but for them to proclaim it is fairly telling. So interesting.
It's almost, for a week there, people contemplated O'Toole.
Mm-hmm.
They had a taste of him. They took a look at him, and they took a second look at him, and then they didn't like what they saw. It eroded back that that moment of brilliance for him, that where he was ahead 2 or 3 percentage points in the polls. That's dissipated, and where I guess there's looks like people are settling with Justin, even though his brand is tarnished. It certainly appeared to be, but a lot of people are maybe voting for the party.
Yeah.
I find it interesting is that you talk about people took a second look, and we alluded to this a bit, and I think I did in my comments. I don't know if we did it before the broadcast or during. It may not necessarily be the people that did the people themselves that are conservatives take a second look. We're back to this question, right? Did they lose faith in O'Toole for some reason? I don't think that he actually, as a candidate, did anything that really was so flagrantly awful to scare people off, right? When they took the second look. Maybe it's just the position he's in as a leader of the conservative movement that's pretty divided. That's the right side of the spectrum, right? Yeah.
It's funny you'd say that on a personal level. Just anecdotally, I'll just share this within my circle of friends and family. It was very interesting to see the eyebrows that were raised with O'Toole. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. Sometimes you're like, oh, you know what? He's a better public speaker than I thought, or he made a good point about this. And then, the next time. So he's been again, this is just anecdotal, but in my estimation from what I've seen, he's been a little bit up and down with regards to how how people feel about him. And I do think elections can be very much based on feelings about certain leaders and how they speak and all that stuff. You have to think of the general population as a whole, and I think a lot of it goes by feel. So
Yeah.
apparently not.
So does the question go to their handling of the pandemic, and that in general, you know what I mean?
think so.
People are like, you know what? The job they've done isn't too bad, despite all the noise. You know what I mean? Right? It's like, is it that? Like we get caught in these echo chambers when we see these big protests, these anti this, anti that. But is that truly representative of the greater population, right? That there's that many people, like people throwing gravel at the prime minister. Like there are things we've seen on this campaign trail in my lifetime and never thought we would see in a Canadian election.
Agreed.
And at times it's a little creepy, to me, to kind of see how anxious people want to follow this template that we saw happen down south about how you express your anger, your angst, when the best way to do it is at the ballot box. You know what I mean? You that angry, get them voted out, right? But I mean, these images of Trudeau being lynched, like it's still emblazoned in my mind. Some of the stuff we saw, it's like, really, this is what you want to go to express your anger? You know what I mean? When it could be another way. But yeah.
Mm.
But is this the start of it? And that's
well,
kind of
yeah.
the
Is
thing
this the
that
start of
scares
it?
me.
And is it the mimicking that we absolutely need to avoid to have happen? Because we don't. Yeah, I know that's
Mhm.
exactly it. So that's, I think, to Vince's point. I didn't ever anticipate. Okay, you get, maybe I'm a little bit delusional, but I think our protests are largely fairly what they're supposed to be, just that, peaceful and protesting your point, and making we have that right to make our political wills known, be it on on the ballot box or on a peaceful protest. But to just be irresponsible and make yourself look stupid and your cause, for whatever it is, look stupid is not. I mean, it made headlines for all the wrong reasons. And thankfully, I actually think the media did a fairly tasteful job covering it. So, on the whole.
The Canadian electorate has proven that it can be fickle. You know what I mean? Whether it's at the provincial level, municipal level, federal level. Like 10 years ago, we're talking about the orange wave sweeping through Quebec. Talk about in our lifetime, something that we sort of didn't see happen. You know what I mean? The NDP with Jack, you know what I mean? Just Jack Layton rolling through and coming to power, powered by Quebec to become the royal opposition. Who saw that coming in that election back then? But look where they are now when it comes to Quebec. The NDP. Are they even registering a pulse in that province just in a decade, right? It can change so fast, and probably for just reasons too. That electorate there just didn't. They tried something new, they didn't like it, and went, okay, let's go back to the old dogs, right?
I think, I think Canadian voters are interesting because you have someone like Jagmeet Singh, who I believe he's the most popular party leader, but that doesn't translate necessarily into political victory. So Canadians, I think they like him. I think they like a lot of things that the NDP people say. But I think, like I said early in this live stream, it's a different thing when you're in that booth and you have the pen in your hand and you're going to vote. And I think a lot of people, maybe they get cold feet, they get nervous, and they go back to what they know. And I think for the most part, a lot of people are generally happy with how Trudeau has handled the pandemic specifically. And I think the stakes are so high with that, and that is such a dominating issue, especially with what happened in Alberta just before the election, that brought it right front and center again. I mean, yeah, that's kind of my read on it. Jagmeet is incredibly popular, but I mean, he lost 15 seats in the last election, and I think people are. I think they're, like you said, they're fickle. So I'm really curious to see what turnout was like for this election compared to other ones.
Same. I was just going to mention that too. I really want to know where the percentages lies in terms of the population, because I don't know, some would argue way more people may come out because of the pandemic and whatnot, and some would argue conversely that not many people wanted to. So
maybe O'Toole didn't go far right enough, and didn't give enough of that stuff to motivate people to get to the polls. Maybe they thought he was not as aggressive as they thought he should be on some issues, and he couldn't peel off liberal voters and then couldn't motivate conservatives to get to the polls. I don't know. We'll see.
I can stand corrected on this, and maybe you guys can, but I listened to one French debate, saw one French debate, and listened and watched the English language debate too. And it's always easy to attack the incumbents. You know what I mean? Doesn't matter what stripe they are. You can, because there's a track record that you can go after them on. But here's the one thing I never really truly heard clearly articulated, right? What would you have done differently?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? What would you, O'Toole, have done differently if you had the hands on the coffers, the national coffers, you know what I mean, and all of the levers to push and pull? What would you have really done differently than Mr. Trudeau? You know what I mean? Jagmeet, you know what I mean? Because and once again, for the record, not here to defend Trudeau. You know what I mean? I can categorically say, you know what I mean? Didn't even vote for him the last time. So, but what would you have done differently? Because as a journalist, I'm sitting there trying to listen. It's like, okay, give me some meat. How would you have handled this differently this time around? And I never really walked away from any of their answers because they just spun it back to attacking him on his record. Did you guys hear anything differently? And I wonder if that's what the electorate heard too, in the end.
Well,
a lot of
classic
noise, a
political
lot of sizzle,
spin, right?
no steak, right?
That's right.
I think people were pretty happy with the supports, despite the talk of a ballooning deficit and fears of when are we going to repay the deficit. But nobody's ever really criticized and said they wouldn't have put all the various supports, the 7 or 8 supports, continuing with them. That was a safety blanket we had. Everybody used it. Everybody benefited. So nobody, that was something that kept us spending. Nobody was out in the street. So I think there's some gratitude for that, some respect for that. And, at some point, we will start to address our deficit or at least our GDP ratio to our debt to GDP ratio. But for now we're kind of relieved, and that was what Trudeau entered this campaign thinking, okay, I'm going to ride that wave of gratitude to a majority. He was doing better than he is now. He thought he was within reach, 15 seats from a majority entering this campaign. He's not going to get it. So the gratitude wasn't that great, but I think one of the stories of the election.
I think it paid off in the Canadian way. It pays off.
Yeah.
No, that's
Well, as I mine down a bit more in the CBC numbers here, I was just trying to track them because I've been talking about elected and leading combined. But when you break it down a little bit more, the Conservatives are actually elected in 61 ridings so far, the Liberals in 51. It's on the leading side of things where things are pointing differently right now still. You have the Liberals leading in 101 and the Cons leading in 58, the Conservatives leading in 58. But the percentage share of the vote is just tightening up. As
crazy.
we've been
It's
chatting.
really
when you look in the prairies, the Conservatives have such a vast plurality in all of those that they call it after five polls close because they're like double the vote, whereas in other ridings it's a little closer. So I think it's just kind of the dynamics where the Conservatives have this surfeit of votes and in those three provinces. One answer for that.
100%.
I want to tie back actually to something we were talking about, the tenor of the election, and there was something that struck me out of the Mark Romoff interview when I was wrapping it up with him. And I don't know if some of you guys picked this up, and maybe our listeners, and our viewers did. In the end, the people we report on, the people that we deal with through the DCN and the JOC, they will work with whatever stripe is in power in the end because they represent an industry. Things need to get built. People need to be trained. Funds need to flow. Right.
They will burn
exactly.
they won't burn a bridge.
They won't burn a bridge. And yeah, and I decided to ask Mark because I'm figuring, okay, he's not representing the B3 council anymore, and it's like, okay, well, you can see it in the interview. It's like, who do you think? How's it going to lean? What are you going to tell me? And actually, his answer was quite the Canadian answer, but also I think it's the smart answer of this industry too. It's like he just wants somebody that will work and make Canada work. You know what I mean? And of course, that'll help the industry and, help things get built. But in the end, it's like when we do our coverage and it's like we cover the issues from climate change to housing. Like Richard Lyle's been talking about housing and social type of construction and infrastructure. Well, I've been around now for 15 years. My first interview with Richard 15 years ago was about that. You know what I mean? About affordable housing. And these guys will work with whoever is in power. Sometimes it surprises you how overtly they are supportive of some people once they do get in, but we got to separate that, the personal from our reporting. So we cover everybody fairly, and it just strikes me that I think that's where we're at as far as an industry. I think this industry will work with whoever wins, if it's a Trudeau minority or majority. I don't think that the industry is going to be ticked off. I think it makes it easier if they return to power, because the bureaucrats will be in place that they're used to dealing with, the staffers, the ministers. Maybe there'll be some juggling, right? But you've covered enough politics for us, both stateside and here in Canada. That moment after an election, right? What do you seek from our sources when you're doing your stories? What kind of react are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody, like we said at the beginning when we all kind of ran through our stories, I don't think the issues that the industry is dealing with have changed a ton. That's probably a bad thing, because I think there's some issues that have probably lingered longer than they should. But I think the thing that they all say is they just want a seat at the table and they want to be listened to. I think the most frustrated I've seen a lot of my sources is when they can't even get someone on the phone. They can't even talk to someone about an issue that's happening. They're just being ignored, and they don't care what government it is. I think that's what I see. And I guess when I call these people up and I want to talk to them, I just want to know, what kind of relationship do you want to see formed with this new government, and they'll talk through it, kind of their laundry list.
And curious, because we have our other two on the ground reporters here, Don and Ange. Election, yes, we got to wait for the mail-in votes and to have this all officially done. But Angela, what are you thinking about when it comes to the first React story that you're going to do post-election? What are you going to kind of be asking some of your folks?
Yes, I'll probably be talking to the provincial stakeholders on this. So they have, different issues, more regional, local issues, but they, like Russ said, they all have the same, like they know, and when you're talking about getting money flowing, for example, they know it's coming from the federal government to the provincial government to the municipal government. So there are issues there that kind of cover all of them. And that's what they were talking to me about initially, and I'm sure that's what they'll be talking to me about, no matter what party is in power. I think they're going to want the same things. I don't think it's going to change, what their wants and asks are. They're still going to ask the same things from any party that's in power.
Cool. How about you, Don? You've done a few deep dives into the weeds around the policy and some of these platform promises. What's kind of the first question or first couple of questions you're looking at to follow up on as far as initiatives?
Well, you know what? I'm going to ask, obviously I'll be asking, what's your reaction? I think nothing really has changed. Like 36 days ago, we were saying, what are your priorities? We'll say were they dealt with along the lines of the discussion we're having. But I think the one policy area that has taken a higher profile, and then we'll go from here on it, is housing. So obviously, how did that become and the cost of living and the cost of housing, how did that become so prominent? Well, obviously, all the parties are doing polling. They say where we can get traction. Let's develop an extensive platform on just so millennials and lots of people can buy a home. So that came out in polling. They said, let's go with that. Everybody focused on it. Lots of special days. Trying to develop a policy. So I think, that's something that the stakeholders will recognize. Things have changed. That's going to be elevated and up in terms of priorities and relevance.
Can I make a point real quick about how all these issues are kind of integrated in especially BC with affordability and infrastructure and all these things? I mean, you have a guy or a girl, a woman who works in the trades or construction, and they've done everything they're supposed to do that the industry wants them to do. They're told this is a great, high-paying, excellent career. And then they got to get in their car and drive a humongous commute to the North Shore. They can't live where they work. They can barely afford to buy anything. And then the Massey Tunnel is got to be replaced. That hasn't been done. So then they have these traffic bottlenecks. They don't live where they work. They have to sit in traffic. I think that makes it difficult for people who are at the worker level. And all these issues are connected. Infrastructure, it stops people from moving. These people can barely live, where a lot of the work's happening. And I think it's all kind of interconnected, and it makes it difficult to live in certain places. And if houses got more affordable, if the infrastructure, transportation especially, got better, that makes it easier to live and have a nice, high quality of life, especially in a place like the Lower Mainland.
Well, the labor mobility tax credit that the Liberals have talked about, and you mentioned Patrick Dillon a little earlier when you're doing your summary. I still remember the very first interview I ever did with Mr. Dillon when it started at the DCN. It was one of his things he was talking about at a federal level, right? That the federal building trades wanted to deal with. You know what I mean? It was about this tax credit. Yeah, and they still do. And now to finally see it as part of a platform, and what was it, $4,000? I think it is to be eligible for and travel. Yep. It took that long just to have that one little tool to help address some of what Russ is talking about. And
it was interesting because it was in all the parties. So, yeah. But that one's obviously specific to the Liberals. So it's kind of like somebody really beat on that drum, and it really got in there this time because it wasn't there before. So.
Yeah.
I know. The Liberals want to freeze foreign home buying for, I think, 2 years, they said. And that may not seem like a construction issue, but it is, because you have workers who they're making good wages. They want to buy a place near where they live, and we'll see how that affects affordability. But I think that is directly, really related. Sorry, Don, go ahead.
Yeah, it's okay. So just the fact that it just shows that sometimes educating politicians and, relentlessly year after year beating that drum, as we say, on that tax credit, on that labor's mobility tax credit. So it's been in the works forever. So there must have been a lot of conversations, all these days where they have Parliament Hill Day and, all those conversations, maybe it's, it's obviously it's a matter of educating them. So maybe that's the merit of a minority government. They say, okay, let's expand our platform. Let's keep a few more folks happy. Let's finally incorporate that into our platform, even though it's going to cost us some revenues. So there you go with a minority government. That's how we got Petro-Canada in 1972, and now we've got tax credits and for labor mobility in 2021.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a good point, Don.
Well, it reminds me of the Canadian Construction Association. Talk about drums that get beaten again and again. Once again, to sound like the old guy who started 15 years ago with the DCN, one of the first things that Michael Atkinson, then president of CCA, and Bill Ferrer in government relations would talk about would be the capital cost allowance. Every budget submission CCA put in, it was always one of the planks, always something there, always asking for it, because they believed, you know what I mean? Sooner or later, you build enough mass in that ask, right? And if enough people stay in power, the right bureaucrats stay around, they start to understand, to your point, the education factor, and to start getting some traction in it. But I want to go back to what Russ was talking about, because you painted a picture about the interconnectivity of all this, right? And you talk about the Massey Tunnel, right? It's a provincial project,
Yes.
right? But
Mhm.
there is national impacts with this, right?
Yeah.
National interest, anyways, in it, right?
There's so many angles to this. I mean, there's a climate change angle to it, and like just a safety element to it. I mean, it is not safe. I mean, if there was an earthquake or something, they had to install special warning systems and all this stuff, and just because the region is so not affordable, so many people have to commute, and it's a humongous bottleneck on that highway. So part of addressing that is addressing that sort of thing. And if you make housing more affordable, you lessen the burden on that corridor. Um, and I think there's national interest in it because it hits so many of those boxes, right? It's a climate thing, it's a affordability thing, it's also just trade. If you can move goods and services quicker through an area, that's just so much better for everybody. And also, it's a big job creator. I mean, it's work for years and years. People are winning contracts, they're busy, they're doing stuff, they're happy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's been squabbling over, do we build a bridge? Do we build a tunnel? Do we do this? Do we do that? And then people would get in power, they scrapped it, and then they started over, and it's been studied, and it took a long, 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 long time to get built, to a certain point where people were just like, shut up, just build something. Stop arguing about it and just build a bridge, a tunnel, whatever. I'm in traffic for hours. Just do something.
Interesting. So what do we think then when it comes to priorities? Let's say we talked to enough people in construction. We talked to enough players from our board members, whether they're national or regional. Maybe I'm asking you for a bit more of your personal take on the construction issues we cover, but I want to go around the horn. What is the major issue you'd like to see addressed by this minority or majority Liberal government when this is all said and done, if the numbers track this way? Why don't I start with you, Lindsay? What's maybe an issue that you'd like to see addressed, which is to you as the editor of the DCN and JOC you'd like to see?
I think it's twofold. Again, it's going back to the interconnectivity of things. I think what the industry I've been reading a lot about, and also from my own personal perspective, I think the housing crisis is something that does need to be dealt with. Within that, though, there's an opportunity to upskill a lot of people to help with that. And so I think it's twofold. I'd like to see housing / affordability issues quelled, approvals processes sped up. I mean, there is a lot of red tape still, and our industry is caught up in that. So I do agree with a lot of stakeholders there that there could be a way to improve that. Coinciding with that is within these projects and whatnot. Let's help improve the labor shortage that we all know is here and is coming, and let's do that through better education and more representation from underrepresented groups. That's what I would like to see. So I pretty much just did every single issue in the construction industry, but I feel
That
like
was you running? What is that?
Yeah.
You just
but that's really what I would
My
say.
fellow
So,
Canadians.
but honestly, that's what I think.
How about
So,
you,
yeah.
Warren?
Interesting.
Don Wall?
You
What
know,
about
I'm thinking pedal to the metal on accelerating, continuing on with green building. You know, there's lots of, you know, some of the programs that the Liberals felt they had to expand upon some programs, net zero accelerator, investing eight billion to accelerate green jobs, more money to fight climate change. And I think, you know, it's not a overwhelming endorsement, but and McKenna won't be there to, you know, as formerly Minister of Environment and as Minister of Infrastructure lately, to steer that. But you know, if we got a good Minister of Infrastructure, and you know that understands things as well as McKenna explained it. I liked her vision. Who knows? Maybe she'll be around. Who knows how long Justin's going to be around? But you know, I'm interested in seeing some of these new initiatives and existing initiatives as we take the advice of all smart folks in the sector of the Canada Green Building Council, advising us how to remove carbon out of our built environment and take strides forward on that.
Perfect. Angela?
I think the theme of the night, or the big idea, is this idea of it being, you know, a pandemic election. And I think we saw that all the way through the campaign, and I think we're seeing that in the results now. I think people liked the way, you know, the Trudeau government handled the pandemic, and I think that's why they're, you know, going to be voted back in one way or another. But I just think, you know, to that end, I guess that fact, like the economic recovery factors into that. I think that's the most important thing right now. And then everything kind of trickles down from there. So, you know, the housing issue plays a part in that, and affordability. I mean, the housing crisis was an issue before the pandemic, and then, you know, like everything else, it just kind of made things worse. The pandemic made the housing market worse. So I think, yeah, just working on you know, recovering from the pandemic, getting back to normal or the new normal or whatever it's going to be, and then going from there, addressing all the other issues.
Perfect. Thank you. Russ?
Yeah, I'm trying to put myself in the mindset of a high-level construction stakeholder, and they tell me you have a few minutes with the Prime Minister. They're recently elected off the election. You can only talk about one thing. What do you talk about? And I think hands down, it's got to be workforce. I think that poses such an existential threat to the construction industry that it trumps everything for me. You can't. I don't think you can do stuff like large-scale affordable housing, green building. There's just so many things that if you don't have the people to build it, if you don't have the skilled workers to do it, you're stuck. You're sunk. So I think, and there's so many elements to this, right? You have, you know, immigration to help address that. You have, you know, combating harassment and the culture in construction that people have been trying to shift, and creating an environment that's more welcoming to new people. You also have addressing the opiate crisis that's killing construction workers that we're talking about in our series, Cracks in the Foundation. Check it out. We have more parts coming out, but that's part of it too. You know, you have people who are suffering and dying who are in the construction industry of substance use problems, depression, mental health. you have to create an environment where people want to work. You have to bring new people into the industry from a lot of different places, Indigenous people, women, other underrepresented groups. There's a lot to it. And I think at the end of the day, you can't do a lot of the things we want to do without a highly skilled, large construction workforce. And that's probably what I would, if I was in that position, talk to the Prime Minister about.
Perfect. I mean, I think my thoughts have been known already. I share them already here. I really do like what you just said, Ross, though, because in the end, that's core to so much of any plan of any construction company. Considering the demographics of Canadian construction, 75 to 78% of them, of firms are, 1 to 20 employees, right? So labor is important. And I'd like to see whatever the next government is, whoever it is, just truly a bit more movement on the First Nations file, on the Indigenous file. It's kind of beyond construction, but I think construction plays a part in helping a bit of this reconciliation and empowering and providing opportunity on the labor front, on the economic front for them. I wanted to go around the horn with you all because we covered a lot of issues. Then we have mentioned debates as well during our discussions. And we have a debate highlight reel package that Warren pulled together that we wanted to share with our viewers and listeners to see what these leaders that we're covering their fates tonight and in the next couple of days, what they were hanging their hats on when they were going head to head. So Warren, I'll let you take us from there.
Sizzle reel, if you will.
The question seems to imply the answer you want. Those laws are not about discrimination. They are about the values of Quebec.
And yet religious minorities, sir, cannot progress if they wear their religious gear.
Quebec is not recognized as a distinct society. It's been recognized as a nation on June 16th.
I have said before, and I'll say again tonight, that I do not believe that Mr. Trudeau is a real feminist. A feminist doesn't continue to push strong women out of his party when they are just seeking to serve. And I will say their names tonight and thank them. Thank you, Jane Philpott. Thank you, Jody Wilson-Raybould. Thank you, Selena Cesar-Chavez. And I'm here tonight thanks to the work that you have done.
All Canadian families deserve an economic recovery, including families in Western Canada that feel left out after 6 years of Mr. Trudeau. When it comes to leadership, our natural resources sector is a leader in environmental social governance. Anytime Canadian resources are removed from the global supply chain, you know who fills that gap? Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia. Well, all of these organizations and companies are getting their emissions down. Let's get emissions down and Canadian resources to market so that we can have jobs opportunity and fight climate change.
Mr. Singh.
When it comes to leadership on the fighting this essential crisis, one of the biggest crises we're up against, we've got a difficult choice for Canadians. You've got on one side someone who doesn't believe there's a crisis, and then on the other you got Mr. Trudeau who doesn't act like there's a crisis. And what it's going to take is real leadership.
There is so much we can do to get our emissions down, but grow a strong economy, because without a strong economy, we can't tackle climate change. We can't tackle the issues of today.
The reality that Mr. O'Toole has never understood is you can't have a strong economy unless you tackle climate change. And you ask about how we're going to convince the quarter of Canadians who still don't think climate change is real. Well, Mr. O'Toole can't even convince his party that climate change is real because they voted against that. And that's perhaps why his plan is so weak. His plan is to go back to the Harper targets, to the Harper approach on fighting climate change, which doesn't work. His costed platform, which he just put out last night, cuts $2 billion from climate investments. And so how is it that the experts that have rated our plan on climate to be an A have rated your plan to be an F?
I rate your track record an F, Mr. Trudeau. You've had 6 years.
You don't get to rate. People know. Politicians, experts. Why did the experts give you an F on your climate plan?
Let Mr. Singh respond, Mr. Trudeau.
Let me respond to this. Let's talk. You're talking about the future. Let's talk about right now.
I actually had to pull my jaw up, which just dropped, when I heard what Mr. Blanchette said. I invited Mr. Blanchette to get educated about systemic discrimination. I extend that invitation again. I would be happy to educate him.
It's nice to want to educate me.
This is my time, sir.
It is.
Thank you.
So nice time to insult people.
That was not an insult. It was an invitation to educate yourself.
I made a promise during this pandemic to have people's backs. Every time I came out of my house early on in the pandemic to talk directly to Canadians, I told them I'd be there for you. And that's exactly what we've done. And it wasn't just being there for people because we're nice, although of course we are. It was being there because that is the best way to ensure a strong recovery. Now, yes, our budget showed our ambition for this country, including with $10 a day childcare that Mr. O'Toole is planning on ripping up, but it also shows a responsible fiscal track.
In this pandemic election that Mr. Trudeau called, after everyone asked him not to, he says he doesn't worry about monetary policy and inflation. Now he's saying he doesn't ever intend to balance the budget. He's spending $424 million a day more than Canada's bringing in.
The question was, what programs will stay?
We need to wind down the support programs in a fair way and get the country working again.
We have got to remember.
Thank you. Last minute of play, leaders. Last minute of play.
All right, welcome back everyone to the DCN and JOC election night broadcast. We have the pleasure of announcing to you, courtesy of the CBC, who we've been following, that the CBC projects a Liberal minority government. So it seemed to be tracking that way. Before our last break, we had told you we were quite surprised by some of the inroads the Liberals had made, and where the numbers sit right now is interesting. They're calling a minority government. You'd figure maybe they're knocking on the door, but it's still not close enough to the majority. Liberals are leading or elected in 156 ridings across Canada right now. Conservatives are at 123 in second. The Bloc Québécois is in third with 29. The NDP has leading or elected in 28, and the Green Party is leading or elected in 2. Just out of context, the People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier's party, is leading or elected in 0 ridings across Canada. Now, yeah, well, exactly. Well, especially out west in Alberta, where they're tracking 10 to 11%. Some people were saying as far as popularity, right, on some of the early polls. And anyways, well, I'm looking at them. They have received 286,000 votes across Canada. Right. Right. And when you look at it, the seats say one thing, but the percentage, the share of the vote is a bit of a different story right now. And maybe the Conservatives will hang their hat on that when this is all said and done. But as we said, there's still mail-in votes as well. But right now, the Conservatives are leading in the share of the vote that's been cast at 34% now. And the Liberal share is now down to 32.6. But as Donna talked about, we're starting to get into the heart of the West, and this starts to change a bit of those numbers around there. But the Conservatives right now have received 1.9 million votes, and the Liberals sit at 1.8, just in general numbers. The NDP has been still at the same, 16.8% of the vote overall. PPC are 5.2, and the Greens seem they're going to be holding steady at 2.1. And I think that's a bigger question for another time with another live stream, but more political. What is the fate of the Green Party here in Canada? You know what I mean? If they get their house in order, what happens with them as far as a movement, right? I mean, they've only collected 120,000 votes across Canada. You know, when you look at the heyday under Elizabeth May, like this is a far cry from where they were as far as a party, right? Yeah, they can't break through, right? So, that's where we sit right now. It's interesting. You know what I mean? Didn't think we'd see the call as early as we did, and I don't know. I just didn't think the Liberals were going to do this well so far. Is that a fair assessment that they're doing better than maybe we expected?
I think the end result was something we were all potentially anticipating, but to see these numbers come in as they are is, yeah, like you say, a little bit jarring. But, you know, it's interesting. Vince and I were just to walk down memory lane when we were when Trudeau was first elected. We were at CCA's fall board meeting, I believe it was, in Thunder Bay.
Yep.
And that was what we called the red wave. That was a totally different ball of wax that time. Obviously, unprecedented times with the pandemic unfolding around us this time, but it's just kind of cool to see the contrast, and to be sitting here on a virtual live stream. All of our team, this is our reality now, and it's kind of a trip, to be honest with you. So,
well, I laugh about the Thunder Bay thing for context for everybody else and our viewers. As when we were taking this trip down memory lane, you're talking to all these CCA guys, policy wonks, people that are really tied into politics when you're at these board meetings, and you heard everything: minority this, minority that,
yeah,
right?
100%.
I mean, we didn't even get our appetizers at the restaurant in the hotel that we were at, and they already were calling this like majority government.
Yep.
And remember, we're just all sitting there. It's like, now what for the rest of the night? As the red wave just like rolled through, it was stunning to see. I'm not stunned by tonight. I am surprised. You know what I mean? It's just, I'm kind of curious to see how the NDP plays out.
Yeah.
In the middle of all this as well. And some of the stuff Jacques Meade had said at some point during the campaign about who he would work with. Would he work with the Conservative government if it won the minority, right? Where are we at right now? Would they still work with them in a coalition government? Would he even entertain that? I guess everything's on the table as a minority government. And Don, you've seen, through your experience and just covering stuff, what's your take on what you're seeing tonight?
You know what? I keep on remarking to myself, oh yeah, nothing has changed really. I think nobody's even up. I think the NDP's up 5 seats or so. Liberals might be up a couple. The Bloc is down 2 apparently, or I saw something. So nothing has changed. There is, but at least we got to air some issues. Talk to your neighbors. Participate in democracy. There's something to be said about that. Speaking of, personally, people are saying, I don't know who I'm voting for. But at least they got themselves informed on issues and they researched things. So, from that perspective, okay, we have some more informed citizens on some of these issues. I was just talking about the debate on childcare. Okay, it looks like we're going to have $10 a day childcare. So what does that mean? So people might have done their homework and said, well, that means participation of women in the labor force goes up, as it has in Quebec to like from the 70s to like 86% or 89%. So many more women of young age are now joined the labor force in Quebec. What does that mean? Well, for people who are trying to recruit more women into professions like construction, that's another source of labor pool. And so some of these things are, as we say, are all linked. So anyway, that's what's on my mind.
Warren, you did an interview. It's our last feature interview that we have for the evening, and Don mentions issues. People are talking about issues. You spoke to Katie Fairley. Why don't you set that up for us?
Hello, everyone. Digital media editor Warren Fry, and I'm with
Katie Fairley.
Of
Fairley Strategies.
Okay, thank you. She's a construction consultant, and we're here to talk about the election and more importantly about construction in the election. So I guess I'll start with no matter who wins on Monday, tonight, right now, in fact, as we pre-record this, what does the construction industry need to come out of whatever party that is?
I think the main item is kind of some guarantees and some foresight into infrastructure and and funding for projects. Right now, as we know, no matter who the government of the day is, the money does not flow evenly. It does seem like the parties right now are fairly well aligned with what infrastructure needs to happen. So I don't think we'll see the big cancellations of projects that maybe we have in the past. But yeah, I think some alignment so that that industry knows what's coming and can plan for that.
Okay, now let's assume the Liberals win. There's some continuity there. They do. What have they been doing right and what have they been doing wrong in terms of construction that they should continue to either fix or keep doing?
Well, I think that they have made a solid effort to, engage with and talk to other levels of government. It's not just the federal government that delivers these infrastructure projects. A lot of times, it's either other public sector agencies or municipalities and the province as well. So, I think that they've clearly made a commitment to infrastructure. But we need to start seeing that money flow, and that's what I would hope happens, if they were to form government again.
Okay, and conversely, if the Conservatives, the other most likely candidates to form government, they've said some things that they want to have happen, and some of that would apply to construction. So, what would you say if they win would be good for construction from their platform?
I'm quite interested in the fact that Conservatives are talking about bringing back public-private partnerships. I think that that's something that those of us in the industry might look forward to. It's a very powerful delivery method for delivering major infrastructure projects. So that's something that I would be interested to see come back. I think and we've certainly seen it in BC here, that we have, certain political parties that for, their own ideological reasons, don't support that delivery method. And I think it does take away from the toolbox what public agencies are able to do and how they're able to deliver projects. And we don't have to get into the risk profiles of what that looks like, but that's something that I think would be quite exciting to bring back as a means of delivering construction in Canada.
And speaking of BC, BC might be the decider here. That's what the rumor is, that we're that our votes might be the ones that one way or the other decide this. So what are some unique to BC problems, or not even problems, but like needs, construction needs that should be addressed by whoever wins?
Well, I think maybe one of the big items for me is the concept of social procurement or community benefits. Obviously, the NDP government here in BC has brought in the community benefits agreement. One could make the powerful argument it's really a project labor agreement. So I think that that's probably something that at least provincially in BC, we'd be looking at is, we know that the federal government, through their major agencies, Public Works and Defense Construction, have been eyeing that idea of community benefits. And so I think that that would be an area that I'm certainly going to be looking at, of where the parties align with that idea of community benefits.
And part of your job as a consultant is talking to various firms of various sizes. What are they looking for in terms of this kind of thing? Like, you can't speak for all of them, but just sort of a ballpark sense, what do they want?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's you hit the nail on the head of different sizes. I think when people talk about infrastructure, when they talk about spending, they're talking about the bridges and the tunnels and the dams and the new highways. Um, uh, you know, uh, and I think that when you talk about construction industry as a whole, you do need to look at the fact that most construction firms are quite small. It's probably the owner operator plus maybe he has an apprentice, some laborers, and not to be sexist, but he has his wife, behind the scenes helping with bookkeeping and that sort of thing. So I think that we don't want to lose sight of those smaller firms that make up the backbone of construction. And I would say, I think from where my clients sit, and I will say a lot of them are public sector owners, it's an acknowledgement that construction is not just these big, flashy, sexy construction projects. It's also, the HVAC upgrades to schools. It's, building out a new OR in a hospital. Any of those items can have a tremendous impact to a community, but they're just not as splashy. And I don't think the politicians like them as much, as those big ribbon cutting events that they can have with a new hospital, a new dam, that sort of thing.
And speaking of not flashy but important, I know specifications are a passion of yours, so I'm giving you a platform to address what should people do with specifications, the next government, whoever it may be.
Well, I think, specification, standard documents, CCDC contracts, I think that what we want to see is any political party, anytime that they lead government, they should be using CCDC standard contracts. They should be minimizing their use of supplementary conditions, downshifting of risk to the industry rather than allocating it appropriately to the party that is best able to handle it. As a taxpayer, and all of us probably watching are, I hope, would all like to see our money, spent in, the best way possible, delivering the best value and not downshifting that risk, because all risk is really is money. You can make your best stand to understand it, but ultimately, if you can't, you need to quantify that. And that can add costs to projects. So yeah, I do. I love standard contracts. Yeah, the CCDC, and I think that there needs to be a doubling down by government, by owners in general, into focusing there.
And finally, it's been touched upon by a few of the parties in sort of roundabout ways about the labor shortage and apprenticeship. And as somebody who talks to, like I said, various different companies, you probably see succession planning or, what needs to be done at some point, because you see a lot of older owners who haven't planned for it, or maybe they have, maybe they are mentoring people who you're working with. Like, what would be your thoughts on how they should deal with the coming labor shortage, which isn't an if, it's a when?
Well, I would maybe, certainly, I mean, it's not even a when, it's here. But I'd say that, bringing it back to the federal election, is that, we need to see not just promises or pushing down to the industry, again, back to that community benefits idea, of, oh, we want more apprentices on job sites. We want to have more skilled labor. Well, yeah, so does industry. So do those companies. And I think that we're going to want to see, less talk from government, less downshifting, and more promises to have, more seats in the colleges. So I think for those companies that are trying to transition, that that the owner is trying to retire, and plan and have that succession planning, it's going to need to be incumbent on the government, all levels, to to look at what kind of education is out there. And like I said, it's getting more seats in the colleges. There's lots of folks out there who who want to be in the trades, and it takes months, if not years, to get one of those spots in the colleges. So yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of twofold, to try to address that labor shortage and the succession planning for those firms.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome back, everyone, to the DCN and JOC election night broadcast. Hope you enjoyed that little zinger highlight package of what happened during the debate. Thank you so much, Warren, for pulling that together. This is our last check-in on the numbers as we wrap up our broadcast, our live stream. So this is where things stand right now as of 11:40 Eastern Standard Time, with 55.1% of the polls reporting. So that's 238 elected of the 338 ridings. So as we sit right now, the Liberals are elected or leading in 158 ridings. Conservatives are second at 121. The Bloc Québécois is holding down third spot at 29. You have the NDP at 28 and the Green Party at 2. A little bit closer dive into those numbers as well. The elected and leading, the Liberals are elected in 101 ridings. Conservatives are elected in 100. Bloc Québécois in 24. The NDP in 14. As far as the leading category, you have Liberals leading in 57 right now. Conservatives leading in 21 ridings. The NDP leading in 14. The Bloc Québécois leading in 5, and the Greens in 2. And I'm sure this next number is going to set off, honestly, we should take bets. How soon is it we're going to start hearing about the election was rigged and that there was something wrong with the machines? You know what I mean? Like, it's not out of the realm because they're pulling everything else out of the playbook from down south. And I'm sure it's going to happen here too. Yeah. Well, you'll see. They'll bring it up that it was rigged. I mean, if we're getting accused if those of you that follow our social media, DCN and JOC.
Oh, yes.
Yes, you know what I mean? We ran a poll. Okay, I'm diverging really quick. It's late in the evening. But I mean, we ran a poll recently about mandatory vaccinations on construction sites. And one of our readers, took us to task in the comments saying that we rigged the poll, to show this result that a majority of respondents on our social media poll believe in mandatory vaccinations or vaccine policies at work sites. We were actually accused of rigging the poll to push this mandate forward and that it isn't going to work. You just watch. So now that I can get my sarcasm out of my system here, you know what I mean? But the fact that we even got asked that, like on a yes and no social media poll, you know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility when you look at this next number. You know what I mean? The actual votes cast.
Yeah.
The Conservatives have 2.4 million votes casted in their favor. The Liberals have 2.3 million. So that alone is going to set off something.
But
right?
wasn't the last election the Conservatives won the popular vote and they just didn't get the seats?
That's right.
Just didn't get the seats.
I believe so. Yeah.
Trying to explain that nuance is going to be an interesting task. Go ahead, Warren. Why would he? Because it's working in his favor, and you know what? I really do think the system doesn't work for us. You know what I mean? In the end, because of how sometimes you're forced strategically to have to vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, easily. Yeah, exactly. So that's where we sit right now. You know what I mean? We got the Liberals at 157, Conservatives at 121, popular votes a bit differently. The Cons at 2.5 and Liberals at 2.3. So here we are as we start to wrap up our broadcast tonight. Any last parting thoughts for our listeners and viewers and readers, folks?
I'll just say I feel pretty silly for what I said at the beginning of the broadcast of not thinking this was going to be decided so soon and that it was going to be a very late. Well, I was wrong.
Same here. Pretty sure that was the first thing I said. The non-results.
Confident too. Look, rewind it and look how silly I am if you want.
Same here.
Sure. Yes, please do all those clips of me, Warren.
Yeah, right. I'm very intrigued to see where we go from here. My parting thought would be on a coverage spectrum, being the editor who's going to read all of these wonderful stories that are upcoming. I'm very interested to hear what our stakeholders have to say. We came in with the wants, and let's see what we come out with. So that's what I'm looking forward to. And I'm also personally just looking forward to where we go from here on a national spectrum and globally. We're still in a pandemic, and we have a lot of hurdles, I think, still to go. So,
what about you, Don? Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, you know what? Tomorrow, the timing isn't perfect, but on the other hand, it may be. I was trying to get people with the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada previously. So now tomorrow after the election, I'll be talking to them about their 4 priorities. They're pretty progressive and identified 4 planks, some of which are a green building and Indigenous building. So I'm going to sit down with them tomorrow and maybe not talk about what are your views of the election, but talking about what they hope the re-elected Trudeau government is going to do to address these 4 policy positions of theirs. So it's an opportunity to have a forward-looking conversation with them. And plus I'll be talking to other stakeholders and gathering their reaction to the election.
Anyone else want to come in with any last thoughts? of what we saw tonight kind of roll out in front of us? No parting thoughts. Well, look, for our readers, our listeners, our viewers, you're going to have a lot of multimedia coverage. You know, there'll be a highlight package of this live stream, or TCR Express, our news podcast episode that comes out every Wednesday. You're going to get a dose of election insight and analysis there. Chances are in our longer form podcast as well, once everything is said and done, there will probably be a discussion around the road ahead with the currently projected Liberal minority government. And all I can say is to everyone, just if you have an opinion, you know, if you want to reach one of our reporters, Angela, Don, or Russ, you know how to get a hold of us via email, either at editor@dailycommercialnews.com or editor@journalofcommerce.com. You can find us on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. We're all there. We're going to have plenty of coverage. And what does a Liberal minority government projected as of 11:45 Eastern right now on September 20th? What does that government mean for this construction industry in Canada, nationally and regionally? So with that, I think it's safe enough that we can call to an end our first ever live stream broadcast of any sort, let alone for the election night. I want to thank my staff. I think you guys did a fabulous job. You did a fabulous job leading us up to this point, leading up the readers and our listeners. I don't think our industry could have been better informed. You know what I mean? If it wasn't for the work of everybody on the screen. You know what I mean? You guys did a tremendous job, and I thank you. And I thank you for executing this broadcast. I am merely a face and a voice when I'm here. You guys did all the heavy lifting. So my thanks to you. Fabulous job. And we're looking forward to feedback too. For those of you that did pop in, if you're still with us here to the end, let us know what we did, what we should do differently next time when we try to do something like this. Chances are I can see one for year in review. You know what I mean? Maybe we're going to have a little bit of fun like that. With that, thank you very much, everybody. Take care.